Thanks, everyone, for your patience. Appreciate it. We are glad you're all here, and there's food here for those in person. So help yourself whenever you would like. We're going to call the meeting to order at 6:16. And Vicky is our minute taker. And Erin, will you be our timekeeper? Okay, great. So we're going to start with an action item to approve our agenda for this evening. And I don't have anything. Can someone make that motion, please?
Do you want to do public comment first?
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, thank you. All right, we have public comment. And
Yeah, Chris, can you do you hear me?
Yep, hear you great, Herb.
Yeah, super. So hi, folks. I'd like to offer some comments on the monitoring point, this year's monitoring report on the ENDS policy. First, I want to congratulate the board. I think since town meeting day, my impression is the board is really building an environment that is collegial, supportive of each other, respectful of the administration, and I think really increasingly connected to the community, which I think is a real good thing. Second, the specific comments I have, might sound a little critical to some, but I'm not really coming from that place. I have a great deal of respect for the teachers, for the folks in the administration. This is really hard stuff. I totally understand that. And so I hope people will accept what I have to say as constructive suggestions, I guess. So the monitoring report is really quite interesting. It's fascinating how people can look at the same data and come away with, very different impressions. Some may look at the data that's in the monitoring report and see strength. Others may look at the results and see students, frankly, unable to acquire the skills they need to succeed in life. And especially, I'm noting a drop in terms of some of the levels in the data as students start to hit middle school and high school. Whoops, what happened? Can you still hear me? I got
You're
a blank.
still good.
Yeah, I just have a blank screen. Some see pockets of improvement. Others see a general and consistent pattern of not great results over time, notwithstanding some annual fluctuations. Some see it as praiseworthy that our grade cohorts show proficiency level higher than state averages. And, others say, well, the state's not doing so great. Why is that the comparison? And then a real big thing, the gaps, and some see gaps narrowing in terms of low-income students, and others, look at some of those proficiency levels, 17%, 10%, and are really upset. So if you see the data as I see it, and I acknowledge not everybody's going to see it that way, I would say we're not offering an education to our students at a high enough quality level to allow our children, all of our children, to succeed. And especially so for students in lower income families. I'd also conclude and see that there's a drop off from the elementary school achievement to middle school, high school. And, if we're not doing any better, again, my view.
Go to bed. Bye.
Hello?
Last time.
I'm sorry?
No, that's okay. It was an unmuted mistake.
Oh, okay. All right.
But I did want to just tell you that we're going to try to keep the comments somewhat concise if you could, Herb. I appreciate you being here. But also if you could just keep time in mind, that would be great.
Yeah. I'm almost done, Chrissy. I appreciate that. So suggestions for so the main thing I think the board needs to do is look at the data, talk to your neighbors and friends. If you think things are fine, great, go for it. If you think things are not fine, I think you need to make some changes. And I guess the first suggestion I would have is that observation, The strategic plan is policy. The strategic plan is policy, and policy is the board's business. I won't get into the details, but if you look at the strategic plan and what the goals, what the objectives and the measurable targets are, those are things that are policy matters that I believe the board has to should own. In terms of measurable goals, like I said before, I think we should compare not statewide averages, but schools that are recognized as doing a really good job. I think we really need to focus effort and resources on students with lower income situations before they arrive at the district's grades. I'm talking about 0 through 3. I'm talking about preschool. And finally, please take a look at the historical drop that occurs when kids leave the elementary schools and head into middle school and high school. I know this is not easy, but you're going to be heroes if you can make a change here. And the community is going to love you. And I hope you can take these comments to heart and do a good job with them. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Herb. We are going to be spending a bit of time in small group discussions and then as a whole group talking about the EMS report. So if you're able to hang out for that conversation, that might be interesting.
Yeah, I might pop on back in. I got to head off to another call, but then I'll pop in.
Okay.
Okay, take care, Nifa.
Hi.
Olson, OLSS or
OLSEN.
I think.
No. OLSON. There's a 50-50 chance, and everybody
When?
picks the EN. I think it's Jimmy Olsen's Superman influence. Okay, take care, folks.
There are also other people I don't know who they are. Michelle Pierpoint and Carla Mayo. Are they members of the public or?
They are MAUSD staff members. Okay. And I don't think we have any other public here. And I recognize that we're not going around and doing introductions. So I did want to take a minute to do that if we could quickly, since we have lots of folks here before we do the rest of our agenda. If you could just quickly, we'll start at the board table and then go back there. Name and town you represent or your role in the district. And you start us off.
I'm Isabella Shea. I am the student representative from Community Council.
Patrick Green, Superintendent.
Krista Seringo, representing Bristol.
Aaron Jipner for Bristol.
Justin Pearson representing Moncton. Mike Dash from Bristol.
Sarah LaPearl from New Haven. Bailey Lynn Gordon from Moncton. Kristen Toy from Starksboro. Barb Crandall from Moncton.
Kevin Hansen, Bristol.
Floyd Davison, Mount Aid.
Dora Fraser, principal at Robinson. Julie Pettis, instructional coordinator, social emotional learning and equity. James John, instructional coordinator for academics. I'm Katrina Zappi, assistant superintendent.
And Whiten, Bristol Principal.
And Penny Bristol, assistant principal.
No, I get assistant principal, Bristol Elementary. Travis Clark, principal of Bill.
Mike Lansing, principal Moncton.
George, director, still superintendent. Karen Tebow, the assistant principal at Mount Aid. Principal at Mount Aid.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. And online folks, Steve, can you introduce yourself, please?
Steve Rooney from Starksboro.
And Kathy,
Kathy Apgar, New Haven.
Liz,
Liz Sayre from Bristol.
Brad,
Brad Johnson from Starksboro.
Michelle. Probably not expecting it. Michelle is staff. She teaches middle school math. And Carla.
Hi, Carla Mayo. I'm a high school math teacher at Manning.
All right. Thank you everyone for being here. Okay, our next item is we did not approve the agenda. Yes. Okay, so I need a motion to approve our agenda. Mike, and a second.
Well, second.
Kristen, all those in favor, is there any discussion? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor of approving the agenda, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, moving on, we need a motion to approve the consent agenda. Crickets.
Sure.
Sarah, and a second? Barb? Okay, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any abstention? Okay. All right, here we are at the heart of one of several big discussions this evening. Our executive limitations monitoring of our ends report. So we're really appreciative of having both board members and also administrators here to participate in this conversation. And I think the way we're going to do this, and thanks to Katrina for some last minute quarterbacking with me on how to make our time useful, and just appreciate that we have this, not many times to connect together. So I think what we're going to do, I'm making the wild and crazy assumption that not everyone has had a ton of time to dive deeply into this yet. So I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes to give people a chance to read through now. And then we're going to break up into groups of, what did we say? 5 groups of 4. And we are going to look at the 4 questions that are included on every board monitoring worksheet. And we'll use those to guide our discussion in those small groups. And we'll have easel paper and space to do that, markers. And then we'll come back and have a conversation together where we can share some of the highlights. Okay, so go ahead and start your reading.
Sounds good. Have 5 and then try to mix yourself. So a couple
Oh,
board
yes.
members, couple staff members. So we get to your today's and this could be around the library.
Email this to you. And then for folks online, this, sorry, I'll share instructions after you finish reading. Okay. So hopefully folks had enough time to at least get more familiar than they were before with the report. And what I think we're gonna do is have the folks on Zoom just have a conversation amongst each other, because there isn't anybody that's gonna be right in this space while we break up into groups. And so you should be able to do that without a lot of distraction. Michelle and Carla, I sent the ends report to you by email. Patrick is gonna share the questions. But I also emailed them to all board members and also to Katrina, who was gonna share them with principals. And so everyone else that's here, we're gonna ask you to get in 5 groups of 4. And this is, I always have the hardest time at this part, but I think that means what we'd like is around 2 administrators per group, and then board members sprinkle among that as well. And if you get to a room and you feel like it's all board members, go find a different room. How's that? So Katrina has outfitted each room with easel paper and markers, and it's in these 4 rooms back here, and maybe this corner one. Is that right, Katrina?
Okay, I was just.
Okay, great.
I'm the team, I just shared it.
Bring your food with you. Let's see, and we will come back. Oh, I should have thought about it.
Why don't we do it just like you would in school and count off?
We're doing it this way, Kevin, but you know, yeah, counting off is not a bad idea.
The rooms start
Let's
here,
see.
the one over here on the right, and that one, and then those that we use for our committee meetings, so most of us are pretty. Okay.
So.
Oh, do you want us to stand up?
Yes. But it's the regular, you're supposed to come back.
Oh.
Grab one.
It's ready to
Okay.
I was like, wait, I mean,
We're gonna have you folks come back around 7:05, so we have about 20 minutes to talk as a group. 7, coming back at 7. But I'll come around, and if that's not nearly enough time, then give you a little. Then, oh well. Okay, coming back at 7. Yeah, see, you're gonna find a room to join. Yeah.
Patrick, Patrick, do you want to mute your session?
Yes.
Yes.
You can print out of those questions, or do you want to see them?
Thanks for keeping me on the ball. Thank you.
Oh, is that?
There we go.
Hi, Steve. I'm on.
All right. So
Is,
I can scribble notes if you want.
Hi,
Okay.
everyone. Sorry to interrupt. I had tried to find chat and I couldn't, but I need to excuse myself from this portion of the meeting. So I just wanted to put that out there before you all started.
Okay. Thank
Sorry
you.
about that. Thank you.
Michelle, are you all set?
I am. I just keep losing the picture of you, but I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. Good. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the picture's not as important as the audio, but
Yeah, that's true. I'm not a particularly strong Zoomer.
but you did get a copy of the ends report.
Yes, I did.
All right. So we can read off the questions.
Yeah.
So question number 1, is there sufficient evidence to indicate compliance with the whole policy, including the opening statement, not just portions of it? And I think I might want to preface this with a little with just that essentially what Patrick has done at the end of this report is really simply cut and paste his responses from the last 2 years at the end in terms of his summary. That's really where the meat of this is in Patrick's summary at the end, where he talks about his view on whether or not he's compliant or not, and gives his rationale behind how how the administration intends to become compliant. And I think they've updated maybe the last section of it where it says current work. But other than that, you could probably go back to the last 2 ends reports, and that summary is pretty much the same. So, and in that summary, he breaks it into 3 sections. One is, are we complying with our academic, are we satisfied with our academic outcomes? And he says, no, we're non-compliant with that. And in the second framework is, are we still sort of inequitable when it comes to outcomes for students who come from economic, poor economic backgrounds or have special needs. And again, he says, you can obviously see by the data that we're still overly affected by those things. So that would be a non-compliance mark as well. And then the last one is simply, are the taxpayers finding that we're spending the money that we're investing is, are they okay with the amount of money that we're spending on this endeavor? And he points to, obviously the votes for the budgets passing as a compliance evidence. So there's sort of there's 3 pieces to this. 2 of them are non-compliant and 1 of them is compliant. So under question number 1, is there sufficient evidence to indicate compliance with the whole policy, including the opening statement, not just portions of it? And the obvious answer is no. I mean, that's my opinion of it anyway. And I think that's the way we've addressed it the last couple of years. Number 2, is there any reason to doubt the integrity of the information presented? That's a value judgment that everybody has to make for themselves. I certainly think they're being honest about their assessment, and I think they're being diligent about their assessments of the children. So I don't know as I have any issue with the accuracy or integrity of the information presented. We have a lot of discussions in the board about, are there other types of evidence that might make it clearer as to how we're doing incrementally? I think that's a bigger topic for later. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add on question number 2.
Steve, this is Kathy Apgar. I have something
Yep.
to add on number 1. I don't think that just because a budget passes that you can assume that taxpayers think that we've done a good job. I think that assumption could be made when you look at tremendous margins in favor, and we haven't had that, and at least we haven't had it in New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say no to all 3 in question number 1.
Okay.
So I just wanted to put in that perspective.
Sure.
Since we went back to question number 1, I will add that, and this is what you said, Steve, about the fact that that still we're not meeting the needs of students. Unfortunately, they're put into that group that oftentimes relates to socioeconomic. But I think I think it's really important that I don't know what the answer is, but there are some students that I don't think, the question was, can students be successful in the real world or something to that effect? And I really am concerned about some students in that regard and would love to find a magic answer for that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would concur with that assessment. I think that the biggest challenge is, providing, support for folks in the, lower, who are more maybe economically disadvantaged. As far as the, whether the support for the budget is an indicator of compliance or not, I think it might be, I think there might be other ways to gauge compliance. That's just kind of one factor. I know, in at least in Starksboro, that at least in the 12 years I've been going to town meeting and discussions we've been having, it's not really been a very contentious issue. Whether that, sort of translate into support for the school system, I think partially, but not necessarily fully.
I guess I do want, to Kathy's point, I also wonder if the opposite might be true. In other words, even though we're spending a certain amount of money and the taxpayers are okay with it, if a proper case was made for spending more money to deal with some of these issues that we're struggling with, potentially there might be support for that. And that could be something that's really just hidden in that conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, Steve, you and I remember back before consolidation. I mean, when we were voting on our own individual, school budgets, half the time the budget would be presented by the local school board, and then it would be raised because the taxpayers, didn't want this program or that teacher to be cut.
Exactly.
So you have a point there.
Yeah. Yep. But I think, we would obviously need to make a pretty strong case as to why we needed extra funding.
Yeah. I mean, I think, my general, I mean, maybe I'm just, overly optimistic and maybe overly glass half full, but, my sense of the community is that they're very supportive of, of education generally, and are not averse to increasing the tax burden if it's going to improve educational outcomes for the kids.
Right.
The other issue, and again, I'm talking as a layperson, I'm not an educator, but I really wonder about some of the validity of the underlying data. Just sort of based on observations and having a couple of kids in the school system over the years. I mean, some of these tests that they take are really not undertaken seriously by a large percentage of the of the student population. Anecdotally, you hear people say, "It's a joke, a waste of time. I don't really care about that. I'm not going to." The students don't make a connection that maybe the board does about student performance and budgetary issues, and they just see it as something akin to rote learning that is not terribly applicable to what they, number one, what they're interested in, and number two, what will serve their longer term interests. So I mean, again, I'm a neophyte when it comes to this, but I do wonder about those standardized tests and comparisons, across school systems and across the country.
Yeah, I think that's a great point on question number 2. I mean, in terms of my view on question number 2, I'm not questioning that the data that they've collected has been gathered with integrity, but you're right. The I remember a teacher a couple of years back coming to a school board meeting to talk about just how uninvolved in the SBAC her students were. They just, they were there to put dots in a circle and get out the door as fast as possible. And, you really could just see that it, without any real incentive behind taking the test, that there really could be a pretty wide discrepancy between somebody's real capabilities and what the test was telling us.
Yep, I think that's exactly right. But unfortunately, that's the hand that we're dealt, and we have to deal with it somehow.
I think however, I think that's what was driving in a couple of years conversations about what other metrics we could use, something more locally assessed, some more local assessments. The transferable skills, for instance, is a that's really teachers looking at their students and giving them their own grades based upon their own feelings about their interactions with students, rather than students sitting down at a computer and playing around
Right.
for a day.
Right.
So whether or not we feel better about that source versus another source is, I think, one thing we were struggling with on how to improve this, the validity of what we're looking at.
So,
yeah, I mean,
so
Go ahead,
we're
Kathy.
we're basically saying no to question number 2.
correct.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's qualified, actually. I think, in other words, we don't think there's any reason to doubt the data collection and the data presentation.
It's the data itself and the data collection itself, the methodology behind the collection.
Yeah, it's simply that how much can we trust what the data is saying is the issue.
Right.
And I think we've struggled with that.
But one thing I might add is that there would still be consistency in that over the years, right? So if unless there's a major attitude shift among students in their approach to the test, it'll still be comparable to other years, right? So even if it's whatever it is and however it's done comparably year over year. So we can compare. So if the underlying skills improve, generally that'll just be that much more of an easy question and easier to pop the right circle and kind of like inherent knowledge, not necessarily thinking through really, really hard and working it out, right? So so there is still value in seeing the changes over the years. And I think also what the most beneficial part has always been how we look at the cohorts, right? So like a grade and how they do over the years as they get older.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that assumes that, when you're making, sort of broader comparisons, that, all student populations sort of act the same way and have the same behaviors, which, who knows?
Yeah, and unfortunately, with the student populations that we have, it doesn't take much in terms of a change in the cohort. If you get, 10 kids who are interested in doing it one year and you get 5 that are only that partially interested in doing it the next year, that can have a big sway in your numbers.
Right.
The other, and to Liz's point, I think I agree as well. This just that makes it difficult to expect that somehow we're going to move these numbers up into like the 75% range, from where they're sitting right now, statewide or locally. That's a hard thing to do without there being a big mind shift in the attitude of students taking the test, if that's really what's driving the problem.
Right.
And any thoughts, Michelle, as a teacher? Have any suggestions for us?
I don't necessarily have any suggestions, but I will say that I teach in the middle school, and we work really hard to make the tests meaningful for the students, to explain to them how we use the results. And I think that has created some additional buy-in just for them to have the understanding. And also, some teachers will kind of challenge students, if you will. Okay, let's see, how much can we collectively increase our score on the next, for example, the MAPS test is given 3 times a year. And so there's quite a bit of conversation around the tests. Like I said, at least in the middle school, as opposed to just saying, okay, we're going to take this test today and not giving it meaning.
Sure.
Yeah, that's good.
That's great feedback.
But, I wonder, if we're looking at, sort of long-term success, is there a better way to measure how students who sort of matriculate from Mount Abe, how they do? Do they get a job? Do they go to college? Do they, pursue their dreams? And that kind of data is kind of harder, I guess, harder to collect because you don't have a captive audience. But wouldn't that sort of provide at least some sense over time, whether we're doing our job?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up with the larger group, because I know when we did a little bit of talking about this in the Policy and Governance Committee last month. Katrina's part of that group, and we were just looking to see if there was anything we could add to the conversation before we had it at this meeting. Just in terms of policy, because I know some of the things that were brought up last time in the review of this was that, right now we have ends. The ends policy is a very lofty statement. It's not complicated. Everybody should be graded at a lot of things when we're done, but there isn't any way to sort of measure incremental progress towards that in terms of just linking it directly with the language in the policy.
Right.
So we were just talking about some ways that we might be able to do that, and Katrina was talking about that they're able to get more and more information now from senior surveys, from the results of people working through their personalized learning plans, which are becoming more relevant across the entire district. And it does seem like we should be able in the near future to get some better sort of snapshots of what the ends really looks like in terms of when the kids walk out the door. And in terms of getting an alumni survey, I think they've struggled with that over time.
Yeah.
How do you get enough people to participate in it adequately?
No, that's a huge challenge, I think.
Yeah, it really would be great to find out, though. They obviously can cherry pick some examples to put in this report, and it's great to hear that news. But you really want to get a broader sense of exactly what's happening to everybody.
Yeah.
The one metric that's at the end of this report is, what are people's plans, and they do broadcast what people's plans are.
Right.
Post high school, but 40% of them don't know.
Right.
So the question becomes, all right, from those 40%, what did they end up really doing? What was the outcome, and what did they struggle with? If they didn't know and they ended up having to do X, Y, or Z, what drove them to that, and what was missing that we could have helped them with?
Right. Yeah, well, again, anecdotally, I have a child who graduated a couple of years ago, and just, among her circle at Mount Abe, what they're all doing is pretty darn impressive. But again, how do you, that's just her circle. Who knows how broadly that extends, obviously, but it would be good it would be good to get that kind of data.
Yep. We want to move on to question number 3, or Kathy, do you have anything more to add, or Liz?
No, I'm good. Go right ahead. Number 3.
All right. If the superintendent has indicated non-compliance with any aspect of this policy, is there a commitment and a plan as to when the board can expect to see compliance, and is the proposed time frame acceptable? As I said, Patrick did sort of rehash his plan to improve at the end of this in his summary, and I think he updated the current work. I don't know if there's actually a time frame proposed, which might be a good thing to ask. And it does appear that he's basing this current plan on sort of a refreshing of the strategic plan and relating some of the measurable goals to goals in the strategic plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of an impossible question. I mean, obviously there's a plan in place, but the issue will become how detailed does it have to be? I mean, if it has to be super detailed, is that even realistic? Is there enough time in the day to do that, to undertake that sort of task? I don't know.
Well,
I
it's
think
he's written a pretty lengthy explanation of what his plan for improvement is. And as I said, it really hasn't changed much. He really, I think what their stance has been is that it took a while to get the strategic plan put together and to get some momentum behind it. Along with the, instructional coaching and, the MTSS system improvements, for that to actually get some traction, and then to have COVID hit where everything kind of fell apart, where a lot of project progress really wasn't made.
Right.
And then a lot of the assessments that the state was running sort of changed, and we lost kind of consistency of data collection.
Right.
So we're at a point right now where we're sort of at the end of 5 years of a plan that we don't know if we've really had a lot of time to actually get any momentum behind.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds as though Katrina feels as though there's really been some recent good progress, especially at the lower grades. And I think some of that does bear out in last year's ends policy report, and a little bit in this year's. The lower grades are definitely dealing with things better than the middle school, as Herb pointed out earlier. The middle school and even up into the later grades, the scores from around 2020 were really miserable, and that could be very well directly related to your issue earlier, Brad, about how invested kids were at the time and even dealing with the test.
Right.
Which is a point I think people made at the time as well. So I don't know what. I like I said, I don't think his plan for compliance is there. I don't see it. I don't know if he's proposing a time frame, and I don't know if we're any happier with the plan now than we were the last couple of times we saw it.
Well, I guess based on your comments, Steve, maybe a suggestion would be to, since we're at the end of a 5-year plan, to sort of look at it again, and through the prism of all of the disruptions of the last couple of years, and see whether some tweaking needs to be done. That just might be a suggestion, for Patrick.
Yeah, just an honest assessment of what failed about the thing. It could be whatever it was, doesn't matter, just whatever it was. What resources are needed for it to get back on its feet? What adjustments need to be made to it? And then, I think we should have some kind of a time frame. The time frame, I think, is really directly related to some kind of a measurable difference.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, Steve. The one problem is that within this 5-year period, you had a pandemic.
Yeah,
that completely skewed anything that you might have had planned for 5 years. So I almost
right.
look at it as we should be taking the current plan instead of trying to craft a new one, just adding 2 years onto this. If we were committed to this 5-year plan, or if Patrick was committed to this 5-year plan, giving it an additional 2 years, and then you'd really be able to see if what we said as goals and objectives were met when you had the full 5 years under your belt, because we just haven't had, you're looking at the outcomes for a 5-year plan that are 2 years short. So
Yeah, and one could even argue that year one was just getting the plan together. So, because it took them at least a year to put the strategic plan together.
If I might add, going back to almost like question number one and talking about that handful of students who just can't do it, who, I honestly think about what will they do to support themselves. And I think that a huge missing piece is the social emotional piece. And I know that the district has been looking for, an SEL person. I don't know much about that process. I've heard many times that there's just nobody out there, but I think that that's one way to make a huge difference with all students, because there's that handful of students whose families are just living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, and those students would benefit, but then all of their classmates would benefit, because when you come into school from that sort of a situation, it's really hard to be focused and to be in a classroom that's quiet, where students are trying to learn, and there's a lot of disruption that I think happens from students that really could benefit from that SEL piece. And so I would say that would be a really good place to start. And I'm not suggesting that Patrick hasn't been working towards that, but I think that needs to remain in the forefront as a goal towards reaching, being able to say, yes, everybody is doing as well as we would like for them to be doing.
Right. Great point.
Yeah, good point.
Liz, anything you want to add to what we've talked about so far?
I think it makes sense to continue putting effort into the current plan so we don't lose any of the resources that we do have towards that planning process, but just to keep working on it makes sense. And SEL, keeping that in the forefront. I feel like I remember conversations about how there were so many priorities, and we do have to pick somewhere to start because you can't do all things at the same time. So if with that feedback, it sounds really like that's the direction to focus the resources for the students.
And I do think I don't have the report up in front of me right now, but I do think when they picked out a couple of the objectives out of the strategic plan to work more closely on, the SEL was one of the two top things that they picked. So I guess, if I was going to answer for myself, question number 3, I would say, yes, there's a plan. The time frame is lacking. It'd be nice to get it more closely tied to. I think we're going to be shoved back in the group.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Let's just see what I was missing for question number 4. Having reviewed the monitoring report, does anything you have learned make you consider whether the policy itself should be amended and revised?
Let's not reinvent the wheel. And we have too many other problems.
Yeah. I think what we've struggled with there is really just, is there a way to break, the goals that are stated there down into something into something where we can actually place an incremental measuring stick against it. And it maybe we just simply want to, we might want to cross-reference the strategic plan in that regard, or we might just say, hey, no, we're not going to do that. But we are going to rely on the strategic plan as the measuring stick. I don't know what else we can do, actually. So
Yeah, agreed on this, using that, very much so. Yeah.
So other than that, does anybody have any
Okay,
anything else to
folks,
add?
we are, oh, sorry to interrupt you, Steve. We're all back, and I think we just need, I think we had one more group? Or were we just 4? Are we missing a piece of easel?
This was group 5 though. Online.
Oh, group 5 is online?
Sarah.
No, there's one
Sarah and
group
Bailey,
still
they're
chatting.
back in the right corner.
Okay.
Oh, I needed that. That's just like.
All right, so as we get settled, I think we'll just have some conversation about the conversation everyone had, and I hope it was a good one. So yeah, maybe let's just start with I don't know, what do you think, Erin? Should we just have folks report in on their questions, or just some general? Stick with our questions. Okay, how about this? Starting with question 1, which the first 2, as we were sitting in our group, I kind of realized some of these are, we know the answers to already. So maybe let's just, as a group, starting with question 1. Do any of the groups have anything in particular they want to share about that part of their conversation? What were people talking about? The question was, what was the exact question? Something about whether we're compliant.
Is there sufficient evidence to indicate compliance with the whole policy, including the opening statement, not just portions of it?
Okay. So what were some of the conversations you had about that? Steve.
Yeah, so we sort of reviewed the fact that the report's kind of broken down into three sections of compliance reporting. One is academic outcomes, one is equity amongst disadvantaged groups, the outcomes for those students, and whether taxpayers are satisfied with the cost of the cost of the education services we're providing. I think one of the Patrick reports non-compliance with the first 2 and then compliance with the third. And then a point was made that, potentially just because the voters are passing budgets doesn't necessarily mean that overall they're satisfied with the cost. And that may not be satisfied with the cost being too expensive. It might be the cost we're not investing enough. It could be both ways. In Starksboro, there were many times where the voters at the school meeting before the merger would add money to the budget because there was a proposed cut or something. And if, potentially if we found that we really needed some resources and we really felt strongly that those resources would help improve the outcomes that we're non-compliant with at the moment, and a good case could be made that potentially more money could be allocated and voters would be willing to get behind it.
Other thoughts to add on that, or different discussion about question 1?
I think our group just, even when Kristen was reading it out loud, that emphasis on the whole policy tripped us up just a tiny bit, just because really taking the whole policy and breaking it down into an interpretation, which is more manageable for the superintendent to collect data and evidence for, is the direction that we've taken. but that means there are things written in the aspirational larger document that we are not providing evidence or data for you in your report, for good or bad. But just, we got a little tripped up on how can you say yes or no, because we're following the interpretation, but not necessarily the whole policy. You see no data that speaks to the express arts, for example, or health education.
Okay, let's move on to question 2, which was, is there any reason to doubt the integrity of the information presented? What do folks talk about with question 2?
We talked about the reliability of some of the data. And that might actually be the part that's questionable. Including like student investment while undergoing such types of assessments isn't really reliable.
Yeah.
For the general population.
I think we didn't think there was any like misleading or anything like that. You know, from a personal standpoint, BT cap was pretty visible last year, so.
Or is that they have? Oh, yeah.
BT cap was rough, right? So like, I don't think it's a good, my guess is our scores will be different this year, it'll just be easier and smoother, but from the definition of the word integrity, like, yeah, like, there's no lying in there, but it was for, Mark.
Steve.
Yeah, we had some of the same thoughts about, the data collection and the data presentation, certainly no issues with the integrity of that. Just the question about how invested students might be in some of the standardized testing. Liz had a great point that, but it still gives us a measuring stick anyway, even if, you can still use it year to year and cohort to cohort to sort of gauge general progress, regardless of whether or not half the students are interested or engaged in it or not. So you can't totally throw it out, but we did have that same discussion. And we thought maybe some of the other metrics in the, transferable skills, some of those surveys about what kids were doing after they were going out and leaving school, some of those other localized things might have a more direct, might paint a more direct picture.
Okay, anything else on 2? Okay, how about question 3? If the superintendent has indicated non-compliance with any aspect of this policy, is there a commitment and plan as to when the board can expect to see compliance? And is the proposed timeframe acceptable?
Well, our group didn't see a time frame attached to the plan. And I can't read from there.
Right, we said in the very last paragraph, we said this is, you just mentioned this is the 5th year of the plan, so to speak, and then we probably need to, I'm like paraphrasing here, but we need to probably revisit, relook, recreate, etc. That was the marking. Beyond that, I don't think there was a clear time frame, so to speak, like you're asking.
I was probably a bit of a broken record in our group, but on some level, I feel like it's not a reasonable question, because I don't know how anybody could have a proposed time frame or see compliance when our goals are so aspirational. Right? If the goals are really 100% of students are going to do this and every student is going to do this, I'm not sure what Patrick is supposed to tell us in terms of the time frame to achieve that end. Right. And so I sort of felt for your position as you were writing that, in the sense that if we don't give clear guidance as to what we really want to see as compliance, I don't know how you can propose a time frame to get to that point. And that was sort of my concern for question 1 and 3 and question 4 itself, was how do you measure progress to something that you may or not actually be progressing to actually?
Kathy.
One of the things we also discussed along the same lines is that you're looking at a 5-year plan for which really we haven't had 5 years to implement. So almost the data that we have now is very inconclusive because the 5 years really is enough. We've had a lot of, with the pandemic, it took away action and time for action, but it took a year, as Steve pointed out, it took a year to formulate the plan. So out of 5 years, you're not getting 5 years worth of outcome.
Mm-hmm. I think it was around this question that our group also talked about, and it kind of goes to your point, Mike, I think, but we talked about what sort of incremental benchmarks could be established that help us to see if the end goal is so far down the road and maybe never fully achievable, what might we want to see in, short, medium, long-term goals. And also we might have lost the plot a little on this, but we had a great conversation about proficiency-based learning and the way that measures progress, and whether we might look at students that are progressing toward meeting or exceeding expectation, and where we're at now with that, and where we might hope to be in 1 year or 3 years or 5 years.
Kristen.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm not sure I'm on the right question, but it just strikes me to say something here about, we also talked a little bit about cohort effect, given that our student numbers are low and diminishing. Is there a way to look at this data, or should we be looking at it in such a way that mitigates that cohort effect?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that?
Mm-hmm. Steve, and then Kathy, is your hand up again or from before? Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so Patrick, I didn't have a copy of the last two ends policies to compare to directly, but it seemed to me that your summary is basically the same as the last two, except for maybe the current work paragraphs at the end.
Yeah, certainly as you get into the plan to become compliant,
that's what I mean.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and that's by design. I tried to stay at the systems level, and the systems work really isn't changing and shouldn't be changing. There are a lot of things within that. So strengthening core instruction as the sort of first aspect of the plan to become compliant. There are lots and lots of different things that are happening to do that, and those do evolve and change over time. But that felt like that was getting a little too far down into the weeds for this report. Certainly could talk about that, and that's the part that would change annually. But this approach, this is our strategy to improve outcomes for students, and that strategy through the weathering the storm that Kathy talked about with the pandemic and such is still our strategy, and it's a sound strategy.
Yeah, and I think the question was mainly just so that people could understand that this is an ongoing thing that has been proposed for compliance the last couple of sessions, except for the update at the very end, I believe, the current work, and maybe some references to how you've been getting close to the strategic plan goals of a couple of items that you set as priorities. And I think those are the things in our group that we were talking about being kind of the evidence of incremental progress. Having a good review of the strategic plan, the goals that you're concentrating on, and how we're doing from a year to year on progress on those. And also the fact that, in terms of just revising the strategic plan, for whatever tweaks you think you might have learned from over the last 5 years, but continuing to use it as it stands, and giving it, the time it needs that it didn't get in the first round.
Okay, and let's move on to question 4. Having reviewed the monitoring report, does anything you've learned make you consider whether the policy itself should be amended or revised?
There was 2 things in our group that were kind of interesting, is one is a comparison of benchmarking versus lofty goals. And the other one is, what does competence really mean? If everybody comes to a conclusion of what that means, but when you're analyzing data, for instance, what definition does that word, should that word be taken as opposed to being left to somebody's assumption of what it means?
Steve?
Yeah, I think the group was sort of hesitant to really try to rewrite the policy as well, as long as we could rely on the interpretation and the strategic plan being sort of consistently reviewed each year so that we could see incremental progress in the evidence that was provided. Kevin has a good point about the end competencies. One of the things that we also discussed was, is there any way to improve, our understanding of what happens to the alumni after they leave? Because that seems to really be a hidden gem that is hard to find, but would be very interesting to understand, especially when you're getting numbers in the pre-graduation survey that, up to half the class doesn't know what they're doing after they leave school. So, what is that half a class doing once they leave, and how well are they doing it, and what did they see as being the holes that we left them with? So that's more on the evidence side than it is on changing the policy.
Well, it doesn't mix.
Speak up, my friend.
Only because I would want to clarify that I think it does say it's an employment / undecided, and I don't know that those should be in the same column. Like that could be a plan to have employment, which we hope, right? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Could be a family business or, a family farm, that's very different than undecided. It's employment, and it's also something that the student has mapped out, so.
Sure, that's a perfectly valid direction.
And it also diminishes those students that are going to go into the workforce for whatever reason from those that are aspiring to go to college.
Absolutely.
Is a mindset that there's a lot of concern today about trades and whatnot.
I was just thinking the same thing, yep.
And not to lift that up, just just focus on who's going on to school is not a service to those.
You mean the kids who want to have a mortgage on their backs as opposed to the kids who don't?
Right.
However that works.
Singing that tune. Kristen,
Just,
I know.
Yeah. Just kind of a question that kind of came to me right now was, when these questions are presented, when are these questions presented to the students, number one? Because as a parent of a senior right now, I can speak very specifically on behalf of that said student that their brains are going everywhere. 5 minutes they're like this, I'm going to Harvard, not my kid.
But, or like, I've changed my mind, I'm gonna work at Walmart for the rest of my, like, it's there, and I'm sure Shannon can, attest to that as well. I mean, so I'm just kind of curious, like, when are these questions being asked? And, because to your point, Kevin, about the trades, I'm almost feeling like if we have the questions kind of not rewritten, but recategorized, would students feel compelled to answer differently? Meaning, hey, I'm proud of myself that I want to go into a trade. And no, it's not a 4-year college program, but hey, look at this, I fit into one of these buckets, as opposed to undecided or employment, because that just kind of sounds like a Debbie Downer kind of bucket to be put in. Something to chew on.
And the other one, along with that, not to drag it out, is I think in the past, we've identified those going into the military too.
It's in there.
It's in there, but
Oh, it is?
yeah, but it's not in, I don't think it's in all of the.
Yeah, and I think my point was just, with whatever those numbers point out, what was the actual data afterwards? A year later, after they left, what did they say? Oh gosh, I wish I'd taken another year of French or whatever,
I always want to go back to, like, I get the whole alumni, but reports that are often in here, but I'm more interested in, like, if these kids really have a PLP, then why isn't there some pull from some of those? Because usually that's where, like, the pride in who you are and where you're headed next often is shown. And I think there's not, that evidence doesn't come.
You have a
across.
personalized learning plan that they present in their senior.
It's act something, right? That
Personalized
every
learning
kid has a personalized learning plan. So, I don't know that I think that's part of the evidence that isn't in here about, or I don't know how you formulate, like, put that in here, make it tangible, but I think that's a huge gap.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I'm kind of circling back to what Kristen was saying, but as a student myself at Mount A graduating on this year, I do feel as though the data that was presented about what people do after college, like, it shifts every day. What we're doing. We don't actually know what we're doing. We think we do.
Yeah, you don't know your major.
No, that's not. And so, I feel as though if we're surveying us at the beginning of the year versus, the end, or if we're walking across the stage and handing us a paper and saying, hey, this is our life goal, that's not, like, even talking to people who have graduated and are in college right now, 9 out of 10 people I talk to have said they still don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So what did they say in those reports? That data wouldn't be accurate.
And what the board's really looking for is, what did we miss? For anybody doing whatever they're doing out there, where could we have improved? What could we have done, in your high school career that would have helped you either make the decision or to, assist you with making one, and that could be anything, how to write a check, how to do anything, just where did we not, what's a hole we could have plugged?
I think it's not unique to Mount A, that people are indecisive.
Sure.
And I know we've got 2 data points where both girls changed majors. So they left and went to college and they came out with something different. So it's a work in progress. And I don't think we should be ashamed that there's some indecisiveness there.
Developmentally, 18-year-olds, even at 18, the brain is not really fully functioned for decision making. So I would argue that
the data is relevant and helpful, but also shouldn't be seen in a negative light, just given scientifically that our brains aren't fully formed then, so.
Hang on,
Yeah,
is it
and-
Shannon, and then Barb.
So this data is from the class of 2023. So that was last year's seniors. So by the end of the year, we have an idea of what their plans are as of that moment when they. I agree with what was said about the employment / undecided. That's big, and some of you I'm sure have sat through senior slideshows where kids have chosen a very clear career path, and some of it's in the trade, some of it's based on what they learned at the career center, and they already have a job that they're walking into. So certainly that category could be split. Other interesting data that high school administrators and school counselors would love to have, and it's not that accurate, but every couple of years, ESAC does a survey to see where kids are now. And so how many that started college actually stayed in college, or how many that took a year off to go in. The trouble with that data is that the end size is very small, because you have to try to push that survey out to get reports back. But that's the, in a year or two, where are you? And how close to your goal are you? Are you in a program? Are you in a school? Did you stay in it? Did you decide to go to the military? I can think of one or two kids from 2 graduating classes ago that was the case. They just graduated from the military. So, it certainly changes. And you really want to know, to Julie's point about developmentally, in a couple of years, where are they?
Yeah. 2-year out graduates should be answering this question.
I think that, we can go back to the ends policy and, we can go back to the sentence that says that we want our students to be meeting the challenges of being lifelong learners. And I'm not sure that whether they make changes in decisions, which I think in this day and age, they're going, like the stats say, people are going to have jobs for 5 years and then they're going to have to reinvent themselves. I think what we're trying to do is get our students to meet those challenges, and that would be the success as defined by the ends policy. So, just a thought there.
Well, I know there's a lot more to talk about, and we talk about it every year, and we're always exploring different components of this. So I really appreciate the conversation. I don't want to cut it off, but I do want to be mindful of time. Any last thoughts on these questions before we move on? Yeah.
I just think that we really talked a lot about like the attainability of the goals. And that 100% is never attainable. And that we were thinking like, we said 80%. So that it was a more practical, manageable goal that could be measured and could work up to progress. In hopes that you would be able to say yes, compliant, which would be awesome.
So we're going to take pictures of all these notes, and Vicky is also capturing the conversation right now. And this will all go to you and to Katrina as you think about next year's report. But this is always a really helpful time to get together and talk about where we've been and where we want to go. So I really appreciate everyone engaging in the conversation tonight and for being here for that. And what we didn't do, especially for new board members, is just start out by asking if anybody had general questions. There's a lot to unpack here. So if you do have questions about anything you see, I know that any one of our administrators would be happy to help answer this for you. Okay. We are going to move on now to
answer the questions.
Oh, yes, we do need an action. Thank you. Okay.
I'll make a motion to accept the monitoring report.
Thank you, Steve. Can someone second?
Second.
Okay,
Sorry, who was that?
and.
Justin?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
For the board. I'll ask the 4 questions. Is there sufficient evidence, and just give me your thumbs. Is there sufficient evidence to indicate compliance with the whole policy? No.
About the report or about the?
I need help with this because we just sort of we kind of created a situation, haven't we, where we can't really answer these.
Well, so is there sufficient evidence to indicate compliance with the whole policy?
No, because.
And we're saying no, right?
Reporting.
No.
non-compliance.
Yeah, no, reporting non-compliance.
Yeah.
So the answer is no.
Sort of silly to go through this worksheet, given the conversation we've had.
I think we also talked about revising the worksheet, but that's okay.
We didn't check yes.
What we can do is approve the report. So.
What is the agenda?
The agenda says
Approve monitor report.
approve the report. So let's just stick with that if that's okay with everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
All those in favor of approving the monitoring report, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the monitoring report is approved and all of these notes are captured. Great.
Definitely
Okay.
the easier way to do that.
What's that?
That's definitely the easier way.
Yes. Okay. Financial report update. And we have that in your agenda. And does anyone have any questions about the report?
The only question I had was on the construction line item, which I think is called building improvements now. The $2.189 million, is that including the amount that was moved from the capital reserve?
No.
Can you hear Floyd? Steve?
He said no.
He said no.
So we put 2.189 million in the budget directly for building improvements last year.
Correct.
Okay. That seems a bit odd. Weren't we doing 1 million and then we bumped it up for inflation at one point?
Yeah, and it got up to about 1.3, and then last year, the decision was to add 900,000, which brought it up to 2.2.
Yeah, and was that 900,000? That wasn't. Was that from a fund balance?
Nope.
That was just a straight add. That's okay. I want to just refresh my memory on that. So.
Okay. Yes, okay. Okay, we have the update on the superintendent's report. Any questions for Patrick on that? Okay.
Now might be a good time to applaud the folks who give you the meat of those reports.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Yes, those are great.
I'm wondering about, I know folks are here for the budget. Is there a value to having a budget conversation first? So that folks don't have
That
to
would be
stick
much
around?
appreciated.
Okay, so we're gonna shift things. I know we have folks who are here specifically for the budget and then are gonna probably head out. So if it's okay with everyone, I propose that we have the budget conversation before the facilities committee recommendation. You all good with that? Okay.
Is that action item?
No,
Yes.
oh, yes, this is an action item, action setting the fiscal year or year ending 25
You want to
budget.
move A to after C? Is that what you're suggesting? Or after B?
We need to have the career change incentive right after the budget.
It's essentially as part of, you'll
Yeah,
need to actually.
so it'll
act
go
on
down
it.
after, so yes, A is moving after C.
All set?
Yep.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen and kind of walk you through I'm gonna feel like a little bit of a broken record. I feel like every year for, I don't remember how long, there's been something quite unique and impactful in this year's budget that is relatively unprecedented. So we're going to continue that streak this year. So we're going to start with some information that speaks to that. Button. So, good. So we have, I'm going to shrink this screen up here. So folks that are watching at home, we're not going to be able to see you. So if you have a question or something, feel free to just sort of speak up and unmute. So we have a few things converging. There's some things that we have been talking about for a while that are kind of coming together. So federal relief funds, ESSER funds, we are in our final year of our ability to utilize those resources. So the approximately $4 million we've had the last few years will be spent and gone and nothing replacing it. Essentially, that's one-time money. Challenge of one-time money is it's great while you have it, and if you build a dependency on it, when it goes away, it's painful. We're on the cusp of feeling that pain. I think we've done a decent job balancing using one-time funds for one-time expenditures like building improvements. And we have also hired some people with those funds that are not in the budget that you're going to see. So we're going to be wrestling with that. Act 127, we've sort of been talking about it as the weighting study. This is the pretty significant shift in the way we fund education in the state of Vermont. The whole concept of this is to increase equity in communities' ability to spend to meet the relative needs of their students. There are two ways to achieve equity. One is spend more than what we're currently spending to lift up those districts that aren't spending as much because of their tax capacity. That is not the approach we're taking in the state of Vermont. The other approach is use essentially the same spending and redistribute that spending in a more equitable way. That's what we're doing. This change to funding is supported broadly. It's what we should be doing. And it has implications, and we're going to talk about what those implications are. And enrollment decline, not a surprise, we've been seeing that. And we're going to talk about how enrollment can decline even when we have more students, depending on how we count and the weights and all those mechanisms. So we'll dig into that. All of those are kind of coming together as we build FY25. So again, Act 127, federal relief funds, and our enrollment decline. So starting with Act 127 and the weighting study, this is a law that just recently was signed, and it basically changes the weighting formula that was put into place in Act 60 back in the late 90s. And it's being changed because essentially this weighting study that was recently done found that that formula really wasn't equitable. And so, as I mentioned, the intent is to allow those districts that have what might be determined to be greater need to be able to spend more to meet that need without feeling the full tax burden. And so essentially the way that's done is by taking the old equalized pupil calculation and changing it to what is now this long-term weighted ADM, or LTW ADM, because we love acronyms. And basically it changes those weights to pre-K, elementary, secondary, poverty, ELL. And these are this is sort of the new weights. So it starts, every student starts at 1.0. And then you can see the effect. So for pre-K students, we subtract out 0.54 FTE, which gets us back to sort of the same weight that pre-K students were weighted at in the old formula of 0.46, but it gets at it through a different approach. And then you can see the weights for grades K5, even though our schools are K6, our 6th grade students are weighted differently than our 5th grade students. We have multiple 5-6 classrooms. 5th graders in that classroom are weighted differently than the 6th graders in that classroom. And then, so 6, 8, 9, 12. Free reduced lunch. So all these others you can see are adding to that 1.0. So a student who is in grades 9 through 12 has a weight of 1.39. If that student in grades 9 through 12 is also on free reduced lunch, it's 1.39 plus 1.03. And if they're in this case, it wouldn't apply, but if they're a sixth grader, it's the 1.0 plus the 0.36. And if they're on free reduced lunch, plus the 1.03. And if they live in one of those population densities, that's another additive. So these can accumulate to give some pretty significant weights to some students. And then you can see the small school size. So there's population density separate from that is small schools. And separate from that, and this is a pretty significant driver, is English language learner status, which is a plus 2.49. So all of these, so basically each of our enrolled students with these weights assigned gives us our total weight, and the long-term weighted ADM is a 2-year average of those calculations.
So do we have underneath the density one?
Mm-hmm.
I guess my first question, is that for the district or would that be for the town?
I believe it's the district. Floyd, do you have that off the top of your head?
I do. It's it is by district.
And then do we fall in any one of those?
We do the least advantageous one.
55 to 99.
Correct.
And so we do have some schools that also benefit from that small schools enrollment factor. It's a plans, right? So take the small schools grant that used to exist is now gone, and this essentially replaces that.
So if you have a couple schools right over 100, if some of those students were in one of the smaller schools, they would be weighted more.
Yeah, so Robinson has 98 students right now.
As of today, 99.
99. Well, stop it, Adora. We're gonna get weighted differently pretty soon.
I was hoping to get to 100, but maybe I was.
No, not
Important to note, it's okay to add now, right?
October's not over yet.
Right, so there's a 20, well, it's pretty close to the end. So this is based on a 20-day count from the 10th day of school to the 30th day of school.
Correct.
And that's how they determine the average daily membership. Then they apply these weights to that, and they take it to your average. Is that
When everybody got sick.
right?
Is there another screen with weights, or are these the only weights?
These are the weights.
So wasn't there also consideration of students receiving specialized services in the past in the weighting, or was that never factored in? Like number of kids on IEPs, or that was never.
I don't recall students in IEPs because there's a separate funding
Right.
mechanism for special education, as there currently is a separate funding mechanism for special education with a block grant.
Gotcha.
Right, so that's fun with weights.
Whoever created those.
So this is a way, you're going to see various attempts in here to try and help you make sense of, so what does that all mean? So these are districts that we are adjacent to. We included Winooski as an example, sort of as an outlier in a different direction than what you see here in some other districts, to give you a sense of what's kind of happening throughout the state, but in particular in our region. So if we look at that highlighted yellow, if we look at FY24 enrolled students under the old formula compared to FY24 enrolled students, so the same heads in schools, right? But the different formula applied, it equates to a loss of 74.29 equalized pupils if we kind of use that old version, the old formula in MAUSD. Multiply that 74 students by about $20,000. And that's the financial impact that we're feeling, which you'll see when we get to the tax rate implications. So again, that's sort of trying to give you a sense from the old formula. What you're going to see is not a reduction of 74 equalized pupils, because we aren't doing equalized pupils anymore. But that puts it into a context you're more familiar with from years past. And then if we take our actual tax rate for FY24, 1.4991, and again, using the same information, but this new formula, that tax rate is now 159.57. So there's more or less a 10-cent tax impact with the exact same spending, exact same number of students, everything else staying essentially the same. You can see some variability. So we were down 74 students as this formula changed. Champlain Valley School District down 483 students. Versus Winooski up 387 students. So again, the intent here is not intended, so it is not, the purpose of this is not so Winooski residents have a dramatically lower tax rate than everybody else. The intent here is so that Winooski can spend a lot more than they're currently spending to meet their relatively high student need without paying way, way more in taxes than what everybody else is paying. Whether or not that materializes is up to decisions that are made at the local level. So you can see it's a pretty significant shift in the impact. A bit more moderate here in Addison County, but there are some extremes within the Champlain Valley region. And again, obviously this has a wide-ranging impact, absolutely supported by superintendents throughout the Champlain Valley, despite the disparities and the impact it's going to have to manage this and message this, frankly.
Patrick, what can you attribute that loss of almost 500 students at CVU or at Champlain Valley?
It's the way the formula works and what it gives weight to and what it doesn't give weight to. And so this would suggest that under the new formula, the relative need in Champlain Valley is less than the relative need in Winooski. And so I think that they're probably among the more significant I guess outliers, for lack of a better term, in one direction and the other. And I think folks would acknowledge the complexities of Winooski and the various challenges that community faces are different than those that are faced in the Champlain Valley community. And this is an attempt to reflect that. Okay. I'll leave that sort of pause at the end of each to at least let it soak in, if not give time for questions to formulate. But certainly if you have a question about a previous slide, just let me know. So what does that really mean for MAUSD? As I said, no increase in spending and no decrease in enrollment, tax rate still goes up. As it happens, we do expect expenses to increase and we do expect enrollment to decline. So we're going to have those effects that compound even if we hadn't done those. There are a couple of really significant factors to keep in mind here. The homestead tax rate before CLA is applied is capped at 5%. It does not matter what the tax rate would be based on your spending per pupil. It's capped at 5%. It cannot go above 5%. If we don't take advantage of that cap, let's say ours comes in at a 4.5% increase, we are not eligible for that tax rate cap in any future year. So if we want to take advantage of that 5% cap in future years, we have to take advantage of that 5% cap this year. Good news, I don't think that's going to be a problem. See that in a little bit.
Spend 5%. Gotcha.
Yep.
But not more than.
Yours.
There's no not more than.
Yeah, but
It's
it caps at
if your
5%,
tax rate
that means
is
no more than.
it will not go up more than 5%, even if by your numbers and your spending it should go up 40%.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Where's
So-
the other percent come from?
Well, so that's where it gets kind of interesting, right? So if lots of districts spend way above the 5%, the money just doesn't sort of come out of nowhere, right? That will likely impact the yield that is set. When the yield is set lower, more districts might become eligible for the cap. which then might make the yield go down again, which might make more districts become eligible. And we sort of start from this broad, maybe broad is not the best way to describe it. We start with relatively few districts, or whatever the number is, eligible at that 5% cap. But that could increase as the yield gets refined and actually lands somewhere. The race to zero is sort of how it's being discussed in business manager world. More on that later. Let that one percolate for a little bit. So that's it. That's an important piece. Taxes cannot go up more than 5%. And that's out through FY29, 5% annually. So long as you took advantage of the cap the year before, you're eligible to take advantage of that cap the next year out through FY29. Also, your cost per pupil increases can't be over 10% without being required to go before a tax review board to determine if you're eligible. This all likely happens after the voters have passed a budget. At that point, so let's say, you know what, let's let the percent increase in the pupil go to 12%. And we'll convince that tax review board that our spending is justifiable. And we put out a budget and it's voted and the voters are okay with it. We tell them the anticipated tax rate, because that's all it ever is when it goes to vote, because the yield hasn't been set. And this review board says, no, your spending is not acceptable. You are not eligible for that cap of 5%. Your tax rate increase is 19%.
What?
Or whatever it would have been. Ours is much higher than 10% as taking sort of our current budget and rolling it forward. Not 10%, not much higher than 5%. We're under the 10%. We'll come back to that when you see real numbers, but I wanted to get that flowing. All right, ESSER funds. So we've been talking about these to some extent over the years, and these were intended to prepare for, prevent, respond to COVID-19. They began in August of 21, and we have to have them spent, gone, out the door by the end of September. So effectively, this school year and the summer is our window to spend those funds. In MAUSD, we have increased staffing to meet the needs with some of these funds. These are the kinds of positions that are currently being funded, not necessarily all fully funded that way, but we have school counselors, social workers, interventionists, behavior assistants, educational assistants. We fund some of our summer programming, and we fund some educational software licenses using these one-time funds. These are the things we've also done some, these are sort of ongoing expenses potentially. We're investing a lot of the ESSER funds into facilities improvements, for example, HVAC most notably. Those are one-time expenses with one-time funds. We're not going to feel the negative impact of those funds going away in that regard. This is where we have the potential to feel that. We do have a tool that I'll be thinking about and talking about with the admin team and may come to you to request to help mitigate this. And that is the Education Reserve Fund. Still one-time money. All that could do is buy us some time with some of these positions. But the only way to make these positions, and again, we have some of these positions in the general fund, so they're not all going to go away, but the ones we've added with ESSER funds would sunset unless we put them into the general fund.
So couple questions. One is based on, what do you call it, the mood or the behavioral issues that we are seeing right now. These people are continuing to be very important, even though we're a year or two out of COVID. Is that fair?
I would say that's fair. I would look to this audience, and I bet you get a nod of support.
But then again, we've currently got a lot of open positions in these fields too. So is there more people being funded with ESSER funds and open positions?
The positions they're not necessarily aligned sort of one-to-one. I think that becomes the trick. The numbers of positions total may be similar, but they don't quite align that way. Your point is well
Skill
taken.
base is different.
Yeah, and one of the things we may look at is, it's sort of that one bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? Do we have an open position that we'd like to fill and have been unsuccessful in filling? At what point do we say, we're gonna actually take that position out of the budget so that one of these positions that are currently ESSER funded can be funded using those dollars? Those are some of the conversations that we'll have to have as a leadership team to really think about what's the strategy we want to use here to be as fully funded as, or as fully staffed as we can going forward.
How many positions does that translate to?
I want to say it's somewhere around 9, but I'd have to get back to you more specifically. And we actually have some ESSER funded positions that are not filled. Like there are 2 utility EA positions at Mount Aid that are not filled, that are ESSER funded. And there comes a point, so we've kind of moved on from that a little bit. Like those are now funds that we may use in other ways, because we can continue to hope to fill those positions and continue to keep ESSER funds available for them. And then ESSER goes away and those funds are unspent. Or we can say, well, at some point, we need to use those funds in a different way so that we don't lose them. What you'll see in a little bit when we get to some of the real numbers, the constraints that we will face under Act 127 are not going to make it easy to absorb those positions that I just described. And I mentioned that we're going to be looking at these positions and really thinking about what's our strategy and what areas do we need to prioritize. And we do use some of that money to fund professional development. So we're going to have to take a look at all of that to really think about where, depending on the target that's set, what room do we have to move some of this in? Where do we not? What sort of exchanges for other perhaps vacant positions do we want to make? Really think that through. Any more on ESSER before we talk about enrollment decline? So there's some silver lining in here. So we're actually anticipating a slight bump in enrollment in the kindergarten next year, not kindergarten, kindergarten, but in the elementary schools, of about 14. Most of that's at Bristol, but a decrease of about 10 at Mount Aid. So even though that net is +4, the weighting differences at the secondary level, we still would anticipate a drop in our long-term weighted ADM figure.
What's the number? When you're looking with the
Yeah,
weighting? You're getting there.
yeah, we'll see that when we look at some of the details. So that's bigger picture, conceptual, some of the things that are at play that you're going to start to see some numbers that tell our real specific story. Anything conceptually before we jump into numbers? So some of the assumptions that are built into this does assume there's one less classroom teacher at Moncton. You might recall last year we added multiple classroom teaching positions at Moncton. One of those was anticipated to be a 1-year position. This budget that you see assumes that one position does not move forward. As you know, that if you've done this budgeting process a bit, it's very iterative. So conversations will continue. We'll try to get better numbers on incoming Ks. So more to come on this, but in terms of what you see in figures, that's there. It assumes a 15% increase in healthcare premiums. This is the best information we have right now and the figure that we're advised to use. Healthcare alone, the increased cost in healthcare in MAUSD next year represents $600,000 of our increase. That's between a couple of people changing plans, but mostly 15% increase on the premiums.
Patrick, how at this time in the year when we have a healthcare premium assumption, How closely do we wind up usually landing?
Within 1 or 2%.
Okay.
Last time I remember a 15% anticipation, I think we came in at 13 point something.
Okay.
Is that,
To give you some basis, the Vermont Health Connect asked for 17.5% increase.
Oh, okay. So this is already after some negotiation.
That's not us. They're very careful about not giving us any information other than ancillary. But what they did say that was fascinating is that we pay 98.3% of medical expenses in our plans. That's how rich our plans are.
And the legislature refuses to add a cost component into negotiations.
So continuing with assumptions, because we can go down lots of rabbit holes in the healthcare world, so I'll try to keep us out of those. Another assumption in here is a reduction of a little over 36 long-term weighted ADM, which at our projected cost per pupil represents about a $600,000 change as well. So just healthcare expenses going up and the loss of this ADM, that's 1.2 million is the impact felt, give or take. We're going to show you a slide that does speak to the spending threshold that used to exist and is currently on hiatus and is expected to return for FY30. May or may not, but that's sort of the messaging right now. But this doesn't include any financial impact from that. It's just going to show you, if it were here, where might we stack up against what it would be. We make lots of assumptions about revenue expectations. And those ESSER funded positions I mentioned are not included in the figures that you're going to see. So here's a look at enrollment over the last several years and what we're anticipating for FY25. Again, very much subject to change, but you can see we're looking at Beeman staying relatively steady. Bristol looking at a slight bump with a larger than typical incoming K is what's expected, at least as of right now. A little bit of a bump in Moncton, a little drop at Robinson, and then a little drop at Mount Abe. For a grand total of an increase across MAUSD of 4, but with a weighting, we're still going to feel a little bit of a pinch from a decrease in our long-term weighted ADM.
Do the prior numbers include Lincoln before 22?
No, I took Lincoln out of all of these to try and give an apples
Thank
to
you.
apples. Yeah. So again, without Lincoln, we're looking at 150 students lost since 2018 across the district.
But you kept Mount Abe you didn't change Mount Abe numbers. You changed total numbers.
Right. So I didn't change Mount Abe because hard to know what percentage would or wouldn't
Right,
have and all
right.
that. The current FY24 includes Lincoln students that are enrolled at Mount Abe, and the FY25 projects, I think, 80% of the students who could come from Lincoln coming to Mount Abe. So here's what that would translate into. So you can see on the left is the current class sizes, looking at some grouping similar to what is in the class size guidelines. And then the right side is what would be projected next year with those numbers that I mentioned. And the Moncton numbers would include one less classroom teacher, as we were talking about before. So I think what you'll find is those class sizes are mostly within. Some might be a little bit on the small side of what the class size guidelines suggest, but otherwise within. And you'll have access to all of this after, so you can continue to digest. So just for reference, the class size guidelines are right here. So optimal average range 14 to 18 through grade 4. We're within that with some exceptions. You saw lower around like 13. Some were just under the lower side of that optimal average range. Most fit within. So a lot, again, as I mentioned before, we're trying to do in a few different places, show you FY24 which is sort of over and done with, and we have real numbers to show you the two versions of the formula and the impact in FY24 to give you sort of that apples to apples. And then we can take the FY24 with the implications of Act 127 and compare that to the FY25 budget we're proposing to give you that apples to apples comparison. So again, total spending is the same in FY24, revenue and your ed spending. The calculation actually gives us more pupils than the equalized pupil formula does.
Those aren't real kids.
But no, those are not real kids. Nor was the equalized pupil count.
Right.
Real kids is 1,100 something.
Right.
But after all the weights are applied, because again, only pre-K students have a sort of subtractive quality to the weight. Every other student is either 0 added to that 1.0 or something more. So it makes sense that we have more long-term weighted than we do actual enrollment. So current year, we're in that time of year where this year's last year, because we're talking about next year's budget. FY24 is the year we're in. Using the formula we have for long-term weighted ADM, 1,810.78 is how many long-term weighted ADM pupils we're giving credit for. FY25, 1,774. That's where that drop of 36 I mentioned before is experienced. So when we take last year, current year, ed spending divided by that long-term weighted ADM, our cost per pupil is $15,512.82. Rolling everything forward, which you can see represents a 7.33% increase in spending, even though we're anticipating more revenue, divided by that lower number of long-term weighted average students, we're seeing, I mentioned that we were under 10%. Didn't mention how under 10%. We're pretty much at 10%. So again, that doesn't include any ESSER position. It assumes we do not have that Moncton position that we added as a 1 year last year. Rolls everything else forward. So in terms of that 7.33%, I mentioned healthcare is just under 600% or 600,000. 1.8% of that 7.33% increase is the healthcare change. We did add some positions. We've added 2 administrators at Bristol. We added an administrative assistant to facilities. We did add a teacher in addition to the 1 year position. We added another teacher at Moncton last year. And you might recall we made, I call it a correction to some support staff salaries. That a combination of those is another 1.4% of that 7.33. So we're at 3.2% total right now of that 7.33 explained with those positions and the healthcare change. Salary increases overall is another 2.2%. We did add, to keep with that practice of cost escalation for construction services and things of that nature, we added 65,000 to the budget for that you see in here, which puts us at, that's another 0.2%. And all told, everything there adds up to 5.6 of the 7.33. And the other 1.7% is our practice is typically, at least for this initial draft, we use a 2 or 3%. It's kind of varied each year. This year we're using a 3% factor on all other expenses because most things roll forward. So that's what produces that increase of $2,041,000, which represents 7.33% increase over the current year expenditures.
Patrick, do you remember what our increase was last year?
Total expenses
I know our
increase?
per pupil spending was a big lift, but what was the total expenses increase? Do you remember? How does that 7.33?
This happens, I have the FY24 presentation. We didn't have one. Sorry, well, we didn't have one. Because last year, the year we're in, see, last year, this year, this year, last year, we couldn't compare to the prior year, which included Lincoln.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
we didn't have the apples to
right,
apples.
right, okay.
So really, it's just that 1 year, but the percent increase in the cost per pupil was a big jump. I agree.
Patrick, what were you carrying for staff salary increases again?
We were for this year, we were able to use, because we have, well, so for licensed staff, we have a contract that covers next year. So we're able to use that going forward. I don't know what was used for support staff. Do you know, Floyd?
The roll forward, I'll have it. So.
Historically, it had been 3%. I don't know if that's, and worth acknowledging, years ago, never ever would we share at a board meeting that's being video recorded how much is budgeted for salaries in the next budget. Right? Strategically, from a negotiating standpoint, that isn't something you would divulge. I think this is indicative of the evolution of negotiations in MAUSD, where that's one of the first things we share at our negotiations meetings is, here's what's in the budget. How we use that, there are a lot of different approaches to.
And that's a teaser because it is such a great process and we are looking for people to serve. Just saying.
We really did not plan these. So Floyd's going to check that out, Steve. We'll get it to you when he finds that.
All right, I just you threw a number out and it made me scratch my head.
So it'll be real numbers for licensed staff, and it'll be a
made up
placeholder for support staff because we don't have a negotiated agreement for next year for support staff.
Right.
Patrick, the extra positions that we added under with the ESSER money they're obviously crucial to meeting our long-term goals and supporting staff. If we roll all of those positions into this budget, what would that look like without ESSER money?
Yeah, I didn't do the calculations on that, but that would add hundreds of thousands of dollars more to that total expense line. So we would definitely be over the 10% per pupil figure that we were talking about. Probably considerably over that. But we can certainly do the calculations on that.
I don't want to lose them. We're making such great strides in dealing with the social emotional competence of all of our students and giving the teachers the support that they need in their classrooms for everybody to be successful. I don't want to lose that. But without the ESSER money, how do we manage that?
Yeah, that is a great question. One we will be wrestling with for a while. But you have me thinking, Kathy, one thing I didn't do that I should have for context purposes, we're a long way from this board adopting a budget. I want to just sort of point that out. We have a number of folks that are new to the process. Tonight's intention is to give you a lot of best guesses, honestly, is what tonight's budget is, because it's so early in the process. But we try to give you the best information we have at the point in time to inform you as you set a budget target for us to hit. So this is all in service to helping you set a target for us. And I have a recommendation for a target later to help you with that. You can take it or leave it, but it's something to support you in thinking about, as Floyd and I have had lots of conversations and thinking about what might make sense for a target.
Could I just get some clarification, Patrick? So this 10% increase, that's a long-term rule. That's not something that came with this new Act 127.
No, that's new with Act 127.
Oh, and so that is specific to, and they're going to use this sort of re-envisioning as you've done here to figure out that 10% increase.
Right. So they're going to look at prior year under the new formula, which is
so they will essentially apply it backwards
That's my
to a
understanding. Is
budget
that how you, that's what you're hearing too,
I'm
Floyd?
not quite sure I heard the beginning part of the question. I'm sorry, Mike.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to understand, like, are they applying backwards this act to the budget that we developed blind to this act? And then
So-
holding us to a 10% increase on that?
Yes.
You're beginning to get the feel for how things.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Great. And then the
But they'll
second,
tell us after the budget is passed, if we're over the 10%.
yeah, and
we
that's
are
the
eligible for
second
the cap.
question, which maybe is a question that doesn't have an answer, which is about this board's response to when we do go over 10%. Would that be a mitigating factor, do we think? If we were to spend 15% and we say, hey, the reason we have to go up 15% is you're applying it on a budget that we didn't have this information when we created last year. Now we're doing this new. Like, is this the year when there's leniency relative to any other year? Or do we think that we really have to stick with this? Or is it just guessing game?
Well, I mentioned before, feeling like a broken record sometimes.
Yeah.
We've had that conversation in the past about this, like a 15.5% increase in the cost per pupil is big. And that conversation more or less happened last year. Is this the year that we just sort of take that hit because of all the variables that were at play that got us there? So that conversation is happening again. For different reasons, but it's the same conversation. So it's a great question. I think, but it's a lovely, all districts built their budgets last year, not knowing Act 127 was going to be put into place. So that essentially neutralizes that argument because that's true for everybody. But I think your point is well taken that presumably any district that's over that 10% increase in their cost per pupil is going to make their best case to this tax council as to why that should be allowed and they should still benefit from that 5% cap.
So Patrick, what happens if there is a large body of districts that go over the 10% because of this reason? Do they then step back and say, well, we're gonna, like someone else said, are we gonna give you a buy this year, or what happens? I can't believe it's just gonna be us.
There's a lot of speculation right now because this is all new and everyone's trying to make sense of it. The speculation is, this is that race to zero that we talked about before. So if lots of districts go over this 10% and over this 5% cap, the likelihood is that's going to have an impact on the yield. The yield will go down, which means the value you get for a $1 tax rate decreases. So the yield going down is going to have an impact on, so a district that was at a 4% projected increase in the tax rate when all the districts put their budgets out, and then the yield goes down below what they used to project that 4% increase, now makes their 4% increase a 5.5% increase. So that district that wasn't eligible for the 5% cap is now eligible for the 5% cap. And the more districts that are now newly eligible for the 5% cap, the greater impact that would have on lowering the yield, which makes more districts eligible for the 5% cap, which drives down the yield. And so you have this sort of like teeter-tottering until it settles wherever it's going to settle. So that's some of the wondering. Maybe there's going to be something put in place to sort of stop that, or it's a one and done, or don't know yet. That's not clear in the business manager circles or the superintendent circles that we're in.
This is supported. You said it was very highly supported.
The concept of greater equity is 100% supported. The nuts and bolts and how the calculations work and the timing of everything.
It's a transitional thing.
It is a transitional thing.
There's like, what, 3 to 5 years and this thing will settle.
But we could overshoot it and really have this get voted down pretty easily. And if that
Or in 3 to 5 years, they'll create a new formula.
Right. But if you're saying it can't go over 5%, that doesn't translate to somebody's property taxes not being able to go over 5% of an increase. Or does it?
Yeah, that's what I want.
More,
Like,
so we,
like if I know
I'll
that
show
my
you-
property taxes can't go over 5% no matter what we do, I have a really different take on it than, oh, we can say that, but the state can do whatever they want with it.
the next couple of slides may speak to what you're talking about.
Okay.
Before we get to the next, yeah, Steve.
Just want to clear one thing up. If just say we decided we were going to go to 15%, who cares about the 10%?
Mhm.
And we said we're not even going to go to the tax review board because we're not going to try to hit the 5% mark. If we did that the first year just to try to get on top of this, what you're saying is in all the subsequent cap years, we can't take advantage of that anymore.
Right, so let me, if I understand what you're saying, let's run the cost per pupil up 15% and say to heck with it.
Yeah.
And we're not even gonna try to convince the tax board that we should be eligible for the cap. And we
Right.
just take whatever the percent increase would be.
Yes.
It is true that for the next 4 years, we are not eligible for that 5% cap.
Okay, because they don't want people doing exactly that.
Right, and if next year we don't take advantage of it, we're not eligible for the following 3 years. So whenever you are not eligible, you're out of the program, basically.
Yeah.
And if you go over 10%, it's not an optional visit to the board.
And to put
Well,
it in context, your example of
that doesn't make sense because you're not looking for the 5% cap.
You're still going to have to justify your increase.
Well, that makes no sense.
And
well said.
When
I mean, there's no spending threshold, and they can't tell you can't spend money. They can't they can't tell a school district that wants to spend 15%.
But our spending impacts the entire state, and so
Yeah,
that's what they're trying to control.
So there's a 10% spending threshold then.
No, because to your point, they could say, we want you to cut, but you don't have to as a board, right? You hold that key. So the end result would be, yes, you can take the great big increase. Yes, you could take the really ugly tax increase with no hold harmless structure to it at 5%. And should things get worse, you have no option to come back in.
Yeah, no, that's what I wanted to clear up. Was it you can't set your bar higher the first year to take advantage of 5% in subsequent years.
Right.
I'm wondering, in interest of time, can we move to tax rate stuff where I think?
So the short and simple on the spending threshold is, if it were in place right now and all of the assumptions that are made about the change to the spending threshold, because it's pretty much a complete reset because the calculation is different, we'd be over by about 1.375 million. We believe that it's likely there's going to be some sort of a reset to this spending threshold calculation because everything has changed, like the whole structure around it has changed. But I think it's wise to continue to pay attention to this until the legislature says that's going away indefinitely. You don't have to worry about it. Right now, it has a date it will return, and not much more than a date. Taxes. So here's what it kind of all boils down to. This is really focusing on the tax rate, and we'll talk about what that means in terms of dollars. So again, to try and have these comparisons, we had to add some lines to this, so it puts a lot of information on one slide. But at the top, you see our actual this year's right now homestead education tax rate, 1.4991, same for all 4 towns in our district. The same rate with the new calculations, 1.5957. That's that 9.5 cents that we talked about before. So that shows you just changing that calculation, 9.5 cents. Then you have, if there was no cap, what our tax rate would be. One with the spending that I just showed you.
For next year.
For next year, 1.73. So it would be an increase from $1.49 to $1.73. So 24 cent increase in the tax rate. That's typically 5 or 6 cents. So quite a lot more than what we would normally see. However, we have a cap. The 5% cap would not have us paying the 173, but have us paying the 157. So about 8 cents over. And then you would apply the CLA to get the actual education taxes by town. The CLA we're using is the current CLA. It's unlikely it will be that same CLA. Some towns are in the process of getting reassessed, but I don't know that that process is going to be complete anywhere in time to drive this back up closer to 100%. So those are as good a number as we have at the moment. But then you see two different projected tax rates. If there was no cap, you'd be looking at everyone over $2, in Starksboro because of the lower CLA at 2.25. It's a pretty big jump from where we are, and we'll put that to dollars and cents on the next slide. But again, we have the cap, so for most it's more around that $1.95, and in Starksboro it's approaching 2.05. So dollars and cents without the cap, for the 1/3 approximately of our community members that pay based on the value of their home, you're looking at about $300 increase per 100,000 of assessed value. If you have a $300,000 home, $900 that your taxes would go up with these figures. We do have a cap, so it's going to be more in that low to mid $90 raise per 100,000 of assessed value.
The cap's only good for 5 years.
Through FY29, and sunsets for 30.
So in 2030, you'll be paying top line Bristol 293 plus whatever escalation between now and then. And
You're gonna have to downsize, Kevin.
Well,
we live in slums, so it doesn't matter.
but honestly, what I would say to that, Kevin, is unless, and then I would say ... Because there are any number of things that could happen in the next 5 years that change that. Because I feel I'm trying to learn from my history here when we think we have some idea of what direction things are going, and we're trying to forecast and project out 5 years and try to do the smart thing now.
2030 is like.
And then
light years.
everything changes and all of that's thrown out the window, and we regroup and try a new
I
course.
don't understand how this can be a population like decline preventer across the state.
That is not its intent. Its
Yeah,
intent
I mean,
is
it's a problem,
equitable
though.
spending. And what that means is for some, spend more to have the same thing, or reduce what you have to spend the same. And for others, it means spend more and have a similar tax rate. And that's, again, I mentioned those two approaches to equity: spend more money as a state and lift all those that aren't up to where they should be. Not the approach we're taking. We're taking the redistribution approach. And we are on the side of folks that are contributing to the pool of money that's being redistributed. The initial talk that was coming out of this because of the challenge was a winners losers kind of concept, which I recognize where it's coming from, but it's not really what we're talking about. Hard as this is, conceptually, this is everybody wins. This is giving everybody what they need to the best that any statewide funding formula can do, right? There's more to it than that, but that's what this is about. That's what is supported. And it makes sense as a state, and it impacts different regions differently.
Patrick, with this one, would it be possible to have a similar slide? Maybe this is to Floyd as well. This presumably is incorporating both the increase in costs that occur year to year, plus the effects of this sort of new act and declining enrollment. Is it possible to sort of separate these increases in dollar values apart from those, like the increase in year-to-year costs versus the effects of the change in the act, whatever the number is. I guess if we have
Yeah, to try
go-
and sort of separate them out.
Yeah, I mean, to try to get people a sense of like, look, if we literally did nothing, have the exact budget, taxes are nevertheless going up X dollars.
So it's,
That was that early slide.
it's 10 cents.
It's only
10 cents on the tax rate. So
Right,
10 cents on the
translate,
tax rate is
yeah.
$100 per 100,000
Okay.
assessed.
Okay, perfect. So that's
So 100 of that 300 is the change in formula.
There's also the multiplier effect of the CLA, because we're all on the added tax side of the CLA formula, for our 4 towns. So it would be that 10 cents plus the divide by 0.81.
Sure.
881 for Bristol.
There are some nuances to this that are we're learning more and more about as we sort of wrestle with it, that I think a lot of districts are starting to realize, and different districts are in different places, but Floyd and I were just talking today about pre-K, right? So in MAUSD, we have relatively few students at the pre-K that we serve in one of our programs. Most of pre-K students are served in private programs. So the way the funding works, we essentially get, I mentioned about 0.46 of an FTE. So if we call that half an FTE for conversation purposes, and our cost per pupil right now is about 20,000, we essentially right now have a capacity to spend of 10,000 per pupil. The average cost that per pupil to a participating sort of a partner program, I think is $3,500. So effectively, the net to MAUSD is $6,500 per student. When we reset with this new formula, our cost per pupil to $15,000. Now half of that is $7,500. We're still taking $3,500 out. So instead of $6,500 to the good, we're $4,000 to the good. $2,500 times 140 students, that's a $300,000 impact. That is kind of buried in how this all works, and is just something that recently came to light. So there's another, I mean, 300,000 is not chump change in terms of the tax impact. So,
And we might be one of the more fortunate ones in that formula, given that we sub out, we contract out for pre-K.
right, a district that provides the direct instruction to all their districts and all their students at pre-K in-house, you know, with the compensation benefits and all that stuff, it just costs more per student to run your own program than it does for a student to be in a partner provider. So a lot to unpack there. As I mentioned before, this is for 1/3 approximately of the tax base. This is the impact they'll feel. The other 2/3 have income sensitivity applied to the tax impact. 100 different taxpayers may have 100 different impacts based on their income. We couldn't possibly put together a slide that shows you all the potential impacts with the income sensitized aspect of this. So what we've done historically, and it's been acceptable, is we use the most recent median income in Addison County. And we describe what happens there. So if you're falling below that median household income, then the impact is going to be, when there's not a cap, greater. And if you fall the other way, it'll be lower. But you can see here with the 5% cap, it's capped at 5% of that for this median income increase of $99. Without the cap, it would be almost 400 or 20%. I didn't show you the percentages on this last slide. We were talking about that before. Those tax rate increases are in the 16-17%.
That's
without the cap.
with
The cap is 5%.
But we can't guarantee the cap.
We can.
We can.
If we stay below
10%. It's linked to that per pupil spending.
Okay.
So it just so happens, I have a recommendation for you.
Yeah, that we stay below.
To stay under 10% increase per pupil.
Patrick, before that, you go to that, can I ask a dumb question?
Sure.
So we have a 5% cap for $900 for $100. We're proposing a 10% increase. How does that drive a threefold increase in the tax rate?
Part of that, Steve, is the $77,000 is $7,000 more than the previous year's median. And the percentage
yeah,
is 3.05 is our best guess at this point for the income sensitive piece. And it would be, I think, 2.84. I'm going from memory, 2.78 with the 5% cap over where it was last year.
Yeah, if we back up
Not
to the
intuitive, but it is accurate.
We back up to the property where no, you were there.
Okay.
So this is a jump between 5 and 10%, capped or not capped. And again, we're almost 3 times between 5 and 10. Now I realize some of this is CLA driven, but CLA is applied to both of these numbers. So we have a 5% capped number on the right and a 10% budget on the left, but a 3 times the increase.
I think it's closer to 16%. Like 29 cents on $1.74 in Moncton, I think, and then bring that math with me. But I think it's in the 16.5-ish% range.
I think we're gonna move it along.
Okay, I mean, that's the thing that just made me scratch my head was they don't seem to be proportional. Increases don't seem to be proportional.
Between the income sensitive and
no, just right here. the value on the right is 5%. The value on the left is 10%. That's the relative budgets that we're talking about.
No, the value on the left is the full impact of the tax and not going over 10% per pupil spending. So you put two different things together. We want to stay under 10% on the per pupil and over 5% on the tax. So the tax on the left side is I think about 16%. The tax on the right is 5%.
Yeah,
10% applies to something different.
No, I'm just saying the proposed budget is 9.97, right? That's that's the increase in per pupil spending.
Right, correct.
Right. And if we didn't cap that, is the number on the left the value of that at a full 9.97, or is that something else?
That's
right.
That's correct. The number on your left is taking the full hit of the tax increase and then the CLA on top of that.
So the next slide that you showed, Patrick, I'm sorry, this is the one with this CLA, right? So with the 9% student increase, what we would see is here on that bottom.
Right, the bottom two, and you have the capped and uncapped.
So in all of our towns, we would go over. And then when you cap it, it's below the. Sorry,
right. It's so the column in green that says changed is if we call it 30 cents, right? So it's 30 cents on, and I think I had it wrong. We're comparing to FY24, which is current. So 30 cents increase on $1.84 is going to put you north of 15% increase in taxes. And that's at, we'll call it 10% if we round up from 9.97 increase in the cost per pupil. That's at a 10%. Your example earlier, Steve, of a 15% increase in the cost per pupil now makes that, 16 or 17% increase half again as big. Now we're looking at approaching 25% increase in taxes. Uncapped. But if it will be capped at 5% for sure if your cost per pupil is under 10% increase.
Yeah,
over 10% increase, then it's questionable.
I was just having trouble comparing it to the uncapped value you're showing here. That's all.
Yeah. And really, it's the 1/3 impact is because it's 10 cents instead of 30 cents. Is the difference between the change in the tax rate in the capped versus uncapped.
Okay, sorry.
So less of an impact, but still impactful to many on the income sensitized. Our recommendation is stay under that 10%. We don't want to toy with maybe it'll be 5% or maybe it'll be 15%. I think we want to be squarely in the 5% camp. The question is, and Kevin raised this, and it's difficult. Floyd and I have not wrapped our heads around what does that mean 5 years from now if every year we're well over the 5%, we're taking advantage of the cap. Like there's a reckoning at some point. And what does that look like? And our thinking hasn't evolved to much clarity on that yet. We'll continue thinking on it and maybe in future presentations have more to share, but right now that's a challenge. The other piece is around the career change, which is another action item for you. We talked before about we have vacancies. We have positions that we have 0 applicants for. Utilizing the career change incentive is a tool to create attrition that we can then take advantage of to reduce costs. Our belief, mine and Floyd's, is when we can't fill positions, the logic isn't sound to artificially increase attrition. There's always natural attrition, even without an incentive, but it doesn't feel necessary to incentivize attrition when we wish we could hire some people. And when we offer the career change, the board can set the number of positions, and that's it. You can't say X positions in math and ELA or wherever. It's the number of positions. That's it. So it doesn't even mean if you offer a career change that areas where we might think we could reduce are the people that would express interest in the career change. So for those reasons, our recommendation is not to offer the career change incentive for FY25. I will say we are poised to take full advantage of this tool. In my opinion, when this tool is offered every single year, it's not really much of an incentive. It becomes an assumption that it's going to happen. So it doesn't actually prompt someone who was kind of on the fence about retirement or not to change careers. When it hasn't been offered in a while, it's more effective in creating attrition. And it hasn't been offered in a while. So when the time comes to use it, I anticipate it being effective. I don't think now's the time. We made it. That's the last slide.
What do we need to do?
So we have 2 action items. Yep.
Can we just accept?
And then we will see each month after what the budget is looking like based on that assumption, those 2 assumptions. And also the finance committee is gonna have some community engagement where hopefully we can share with the community.
And it may be helpful for folks that are new to this, because there's a few of you. The way this has worked in the past, like, so the board gives a target, we go back and sort of work with that target to see, sort of do the best we can with it and come back and then explain to you, here are the implications of hitting the target that you set. And sometimes that prompts the board to say, okay, we're gonna nudge that target up, or sometimes they hold tight. I don't know, but it's possible you can say, actually, we wanna lower that target. So it's not, you're not necessarily held to the target you set tonight, but it's important that we have an objective that we're trying to hit. And then as we get more information, we stay in the conversation and adjust accordingly, but it's helpful to have something to work with.
Can you put the slide up with the first recommendation for the budget target? So let's start just with making the motion. And then if there's any more discussion people want to have, we can do that.
So to accept the superintendent's initial target recommendation?
Yes.
Just staying under the 10% increase.
So
per
the
pupil,
motion would
100%.
be to accept the recommendation to stay under the 10% increase per pupil.
Does that translate to the 36,350,860 number?
It's essentially, yeah, that number, I can go back to that slide. It's essentially this.
That's right now where you think we might land. Right?
Yeah, and
I mean, I think,
yep, so that's
right.
that's
Like,
essentially rolling everything forward, no ESER positions.
I think though, maybe what I hear in your question, Erin, is important, which is, are we saying we're good getting right up to that? Because that's different than saying no more than 10, but meaning 3, right? So
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask this before we have an agenda or a motion, but if you, like, how far down can we go and still be and hit that nice 5%? We get a, like, can it get any better than any of those numbers, or is that the best we're gonna get no matter what we do, as long as we stay under 10%?
If we cut 2.5, well, that's right.
Like, if we cut $5 million from our budget, are we gonna have lower taxes, or are we still gonna have to pay for all?
So
the
yes,
other
we will have
kids
lower
in the
taxes.
school?
But if we, I'm trying to think, I want to see if this is accurate what I'm saying. Floyd, check me, but if we, so right now we projected spending 2.5, we'll round up to $2.5 million more in next year's budget than the current budget. If we reduce 2.5 million from that, keep spending exactly the same, it's a 10% increase in the tax rate.
So this is a,
And we're still over the 5%, and we would still be taking advantage of the cap. Because we talked about before, no increase in spending, no decrease in pupils, 9.5% increase in the tax rate.
well, I think this is important because I don't know if I'm understanding you correctly, Patrick, but are you saying that to get to the 9.9%, we have to make pretty significant reductions?
No, I think the hard conversations to even be at this 9.97% as of right now are really around the ESSER funded positions, with the ESSER funds going away.
Right.
Again, we have a tool that we can lean on to buy a little bit of time in that reserve. That can float some positions for time, but it's one-time dollars. That too will dry up, and then we're back where we were. But it's mostly the ESSER funded positions that either
So they're not reflected in that 9.
They're not reflected.
Okay. Do folks, did everybody else understand already and not me? So, because I think
For this budget, they are funded, right?
no. So we're saying that
The current
we
budget.
don't want to go above 10%. And we know that means that we are not funding those positions.
Or we're cutting.
Not necessarily.
Or we're cutting something.
Or we're cutting something else. I mean, that's what I think.
And the something else could be a position that we haven't had a single applicant for. but the dollars are in the budget. So that's where there's a lot of somewhat nuanced work to kind of massage all of this. But knowing in the end, what's the target we're massaging toward is.
But we've got to come up with how much to massage in the massage? Is it $2.5 million?
If
No,
we,
So other than the ESSER funded positions and that one position at Moncton, that's a 1-year position. All other positions are rolled forward here. And lots of assumptions, again, these get refined. But this assumes all but the one added position at Moncton, that's a 1-year, and the ESSER positions are included, and that results in a $2.5 million increase, which is at the 10%.
Do we have a motion on the floor yet?
No, because I think we're trying to get clarity first. I know.
We can always change it.
Is it I think what I'm hearing you say, it's in our best interest to add that to 481. Because if we don't, we still get penalized. Is that correct? Is that what I heard you say?
So what I'm saying is, and this is why this was the recommendation, I think the recommendation should be basically don't trigger having to go to the review board.
Yeah.
Great.
Because the risk reward is too great.
Yeah.
That board holds in its hands whether you're paying 15 or 20% tax increase or 5%. I don't want to put that to after the vote. Like the voters have already said that's the money you get. Whether that's a 5% tax rate increase or a 20% tax rate increase, they're saying yes to the dollar figure. I don't want to stand in front of a group, and I suspect none of you do, saying, so we thought it might be 5%, but it's actually 20%.
Nope.
I'd rather go with confidence that it's capped at 5%. Explaining without the cap, here's where we'd be, and we have work to do, and we got to figure this out. And explaining the reason why, and not from a negative lens, but from this is important for us as a state to do this. And this is our hard work as a community to do what's right for the whole state. Easier said than done when folks are facing the potential tax rate increase, which is why they capped it. And I see this as a support to communities who are trying to have these hard conversations and recognize this is the right thing to do. And this is a mechanism to help us do that in an affordable way.
Okay, so can we put the motion back up again for that?
Patrick, how many open positions do we have that we could just not fill versus the positions that we stand to lose with the ESSER money?
That's the work that has yet to be done. We need to have those conversations and really look at current unfilled positions. What have we had for applicants? What do we suspect we'll have going forward? Yeah, so that's work that lies ahead of us.
I'm probably not the only one concerned about this, that most of the list of ESSER funded positions were mental health related. And that's a huge challenge right now, and things are going well so far, but that doesn't mean we should take away those people. When we meet again, can you like kind of lay out positions that you were able to find funding for or shift, and what might need to go away, or is that too deep in the weeds?
Possibly. The trick is we're small enough that it doesn't take long for someone to know what person specifically we're talking about.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And that's challenging.
Yeah.
At least it's at least challenging without prior conversations with those that might be impacted.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always hesitant to, so early in the process when so much is changing, to get people feeling super nervous, perhaps unnecessarily so. When it becomes clear that somebody's going to be impacted, I think it's important that someone who's in a leadership position close to them has that conversation just from a human level. But I don't like stirring the pot unnecessarily.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Patrick, if we take money from the education reserve fund, it goes on the revenue side and reduces education spending.
Correct.
Okay.
Which then lowers the cost per pupil.
Right. Okay.
In that one-time way. And that's the risk with that, right? Is if you use $1 million of the ed reserve to float some positions, you just put $1 million of one-time money in as a revenue. And next year, when that money goes away, it feels like a loss of $1 million that you have to make up for in reductions or increased taxes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
I make a motion to accept Patrick's recommendations, stay under the 10% increase for people. And is that all I need? Sarah.
Is there a second? Bailey? Is there any more discussion? Okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
You opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. All right, and then the next action item. Can you just move to that one? If someone would like to make a motion to not offer the career change incentive this budget cycle.
So moved. Kathy
Kathy.
Apter.
Second,
I'll second, Sarah.
any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstention? Okey doke. You have your
done.
marching orders.
Thank you.
All right. So,
Sure, next year will be way simpler.
Don't make promises.
Can we
I
get
don't
that
know
right?
how we're gonna do this.
Yeah.
No.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. All right, next is
That's not a good one. Yeah.
to make a motion to accept the facilities committee recommendation on the purchase of central office building. This promises to be a good one. You sure you don't want to spend?
I know at least one is gonna be texting me about it in about half an hour.
I will make a motion.
Okay.
to
Accept the facilities committee.
Accept the facilities committee's recommendation on the purchase of the central office building.
Okay, is there a second? Hey, Justin. All right, discussion. Facilities committee folks, did you want to walk us through anything? I think there's a link. In our
I think we
agenda.
presented Last month. and
Okay.
There was a question. I believe there was a question at the last meeting about freshness of estimates or something.
The request that we walked away from here with was to reshare the information that we had shared previously, which was the link that was sent.
No, I would disagree with you, Patrick. I think we were very clear that we wanted more than just an estimate of a 6% increase on 2020 and 2021 numbers.
There was not clarity as a board on that point. And I believe I recall at the end of the meeting or end of that conversation saying very explicitly, so what I'm hearing is you want to see the information that had been shared previously, and that was affirmed, and that's what we sent out.
So came out under
Yeah,
separate
Friday,
cover
Friday.
from Jennifer on Friday. So if you haven't already found that, you can open it up. What we're talking about. So the recommendation is the same, and there's some additional information here to address some of the questions that were raised.
So this wouldn't affect anything to do with the budget and the tax stuff. This would just be a separate vote, separate thing.
And
I
that's,
just don't want to complicate something that's already
Sure.
really complicated.
so presumably, if this recommendation is voted on and the taxpayers support it, we would use the money that's already in the budget to make the purchase.
Could that money also be used to fund the positions from the ESSA that we might be losing?
Sure, yeah. So the money that we have earmarked for this is money that's in our construction services line. It's part of that 2.2 million that Steve was talking about before. So sure, and that money could always be shifted out of that fund to pay for something else. But it does it would have us resetting on a facilities standpoint. We've done a lot of work over the last 6 or 8 years to, in particular, in the absence of passing any bonds, to build that sort of operational capital up to a point where we can get some important and costly work done. And in the future, at some point, if a bond goes forward, some of that or all of that could be used to help pay for the bond.
But it doesn't do away with the fact that central office has to go somewhere.
Correct. And there isn't as I see it, there isn't a solution that doesn't cost money. Renting a different location is going to cost more than we're spending right now. So everything will cost more than what we're currently doing.
So I'm just gonna clarify, within the budget of the $2 million-ish, 1.25 or whatever would be going towards the purchase, leaving less for capital improvements within our current buildings.
Yeah, and
But we
whether
were gonna have to spend that anyway
right
this year in some way.
and whether how much of that comes out of this year's operating budget and how much comes out of next year's.
Yep.
There's going to be some massaging as we get closer to the end of the year and we know what we have to work with.
Yep.
But yes. And that would be true presumably for any of the scenarios. The dollar amounts are going to vary because the scope of the work is different. But that concept of using money in the general fund to cover the costs is sort of the working belief right now.
So do we have to vote on it?
Right, so this board has to vote to bring it to a vote of the electorate, because you can't, only for the acquiring of property. If
Okay.
you vote no to purchasing central office and we're not acquiring property, you're making improvements to property you already have, that would not require a vote of the electorate.
Okay.
But to acquire property does.
So this would be an additional ballot item at town meeting day.
Yeah, so this board saying we vote to move ahead with the purchase of central office prompts next steps that lead to warning a ballot, putting it out to vote, and presumably again on town meeting day.
But the language within it doesn't have to include, here's the bond, or here's what this is gonna do to your budget or your taxes or whatever. It's included, it's embedded in. We just have to find a way to frame it so
Yep.
it shows that way.
Essentially, the messaging is we already have the money.
Right, we just wanna buy another building. Is the optics that we've already talked about many
Yep.
times. Okay.
What if we can't rent out that other space? Does that, we wouldn't be necessarily breaking even at that point. Like how would that affect us? Let's say PD leaves, we're the only ones in the building, worst case scenario. Then what?
Yeah, so as Floyd and I have talked, and I think we might have talked about this some at the facilities committee level. That revenue from renting is sort of gravy. Like, this is the better option, even if there's no rental.
Mhm.
And the police department rental is expected to be temporary. The Stony Hill Properties rental is very flexible, and doesn't have as concrete an end. Could stay longer if that's mutually beneficial, could leave sooner if we needed the space for something. That's the gist of the conversation that's been had so far, but the police their lease is up in 3 years. Three.
So the money that we would get from renting out the other spaces, I remember you said it is legal to do that.
Mhm.
And that wouldn't, if it was zero, it wouldn't hurt us. It just wouldn't be extra.
Right.
Okay.
Well, Well, it would hurt us because we wouldn't have that additional revenue to offset the cost of the building. We would be left holding the bag for all the maintenance, any repairs, and anything else you have to do.
What it would do is make the break even point out a little bit further. I think maintenance, carrying costs, regardless of where we sit, those costs will continue. If we were to move into one of the buildings currently, we would have the sunk cost, and then we would still have maintenance costs internally.
But those maintenance costs would also be shared because you're already in a facility that we own. The maintenance costs on a new building are solely held by us if we don't have other tenants. And my understanding is that if we were to move, say, to Beaman, that a lot of the repairs that need to be done to the HVAC and other items in Beaman would also be absorbed in part of this project.
That number's been incorporated in the projection.
That 1.3 assumes already that 500K is spent to do the HVAC work.
That's really hard for me to decipher all that when I don't see that all spread out somewhere. Just when I just got a 1.3, I don't understand where all the monies are and what it would benefit to, what kind of a benefit it would be to have in our own building versus someplace else.
Other questions or concerns that folks have? Online. Okay, so if there's no other discussion, we'll vote on the motion, which is to accept the facilities committee recommendation on purchase of central office building. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I didn't say that. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All those opposed? Anyone, any opposed?
I'm opposed.
Liz, is your hand up as an 4? Okay. Opposed 3. Any abstentions? Okay, the motion carries. All right, moving on. Well, I guess I would just say, do we know what the next steps are?
So we will work with that information to map out the next steps and work on draft language for ballots and get it all ahead and warned in the proper 10-day window. Yeah, we'll talk about a process to just confirm some of the assumptions we've been working under in terms of town meeting day vote versus off day vote,
Okay.
etc. I don't want to run with that assumption all the way.
Yeah.
So a couple of things like that will be some brief actions in upcoming meetings, but.
Okay. And you have a facilities committee meeting to start chewing on some of that before our next board meeting, so. Okay.
So could I make a formal request that we have specific numbers on this project before the facilities committee meets again?
So I think what our typical practice, Kathy, is that if we're making a request, it's something that if it isn't that it's not a single board member making the request, that it's something that is a shared expressed concern by the majority of members. So I don't know if folks do folks have any questions for Kathy on what she's looking for, or trying to get a sense of whether this is a concern that others have, or if others feel like the information they have is adequate.
Or does it feel like this is something that could land in the laps of the facilities and finance committees together to do that work together and then present it to the board as an update? That's sort of the organic way to do that.
Yeah. So I guess She should make a motion. I mean, she should make a motion.
Well, we can't make a motion if it's not already been warned, right? And I think it is helpful because if we're going to bring this to the community and we're going to need their support, it is really helpful to understand what is required. So that person, so I appreciate that, Kathy, to understand what will help folks to really get their head around what it is we're hoping for their support in.
I'm just really concerned. I mean, we're looking at increasing the overall budget, and then we're also going to present, oh, by the way, we want to buy a building. I'm really concerned that doesn't really speak to being fiscally conservative to any of our constituents. And without exact numbers, it's really hard to justify any of this.
Liz?
I think that probably the most influential question that I don't feel I was able to answer in the best way at the moment for some of the other hard conversations we've had was, what happens if we don't do this, right? Like, what are the consequences of not? And that is why I voted for the purchase. And I think there'll be some hard choices to make otherwise, right? Like, so to me, my understanding is that this is the best way to leave as much money in the budget possible towards services for our students. So, and yes, every central office is a service for our students, but for some of those positions that we're talking about not being able to fund through ESSER. So any information is helpful. I think the information we already got was helpful. And I think that's really the question to look to be able to answer is, what happens if we don't purchase this building? And we will be making a commitment if it doesn't pass. And that will have to be figured out. And it will affect other things that we're looking at doing. So any information that we have that can kind of even a summary to be able to explain and articulate that really well with some really accurate numbers. As you said, you were going to look more deeply into it and get that would be great and helpful for us to plan community engagement. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I think to that point, and also Erin's suggestion, timing wise, we're hoping to do a community engagement around the budget in November, but I wonder if then we could look at, depending on what the facilities committee decides for when this vote might take place, when would be the community engagement around this? And that conversation maybe between the finance and the facilities committee on how best to share this information with our community so they can make an educated and informed choice. Maybe that's something that could take place within those, that it makes sense that could take place within those committees, at least to start. How does that sound to folks?
Good.
Okay. Okay. Moving down, we have a discussion about signing pay orders. So folks are usually pretty good about getting those in, but I know for board members, sometimes there's a question about, it is sort of a weird process and we're signing something after the fact and what is our accountability there? And so it is getting late. And we still have an executive session and some updates, but I wondered if we could just take a minute or two to talk about what pay orders are in terms of what they represent in terms of the context of the budget and our role in that. And I'd ask Patrick if he and Floyd could share a little bit of information.
Yeah, Floyd's done some work on that.
5 minutes on that, and then if folks have more questions.
Well, if I hand these around, Kevin, can I hand you this?
And do you have an electronic version you can send to folks online?
I send it to you?
You can, yep.
I got some questions if they're ready for that.
Do you want to walk folks through this, Floyd?
I do. I'm trying to send a copy to Crystal White. So jumping in, the question I tried to answer is, what's the area that causes concern? And then how can I help get that info flow to whoever is questioning how and what they're approving? So what you have is a pay order process of the flow to get pay orders to the Mausd board. And I worked from the start, which is the board approves the budget with the expenditures broken down by account, a code. So that's when you vote in January to put the budget in front of the voters, you've approved that budget. And then every step beyond that, the electorate approves the budget, we roll it into iVisions. There's two types of pay orders. Throughout the purchase year, we follow the process by entering the POs, approving it by a supervisor, checking it by the accountant, approved by me, signed off by Patrick. The procurement of supplies and services by the purchasers. The invoices are then submitted, checked against what we ordered, that we got what we said we wanted. Checked it against the purchase order. Then they're coded and tied to AP. We run checks and pay them. That check run is approved by me, also approved by Patrick. After that, this is probably the piece, if I'm sitting where you are, that's most reassuring. It's reviewed, approved, and the checks are signed by the treasurer that you've put in front of the electorate to vote for. So that's the piece that checks every single one of those checks to make sure that your fiduciary responsibility is protected. The checks are released to the vendors. A checklist is prepared for the board members. It includes all the backup. So those items that are attached to your agenda include down to $6.44 or $6.82 for propane at Beeman, for example. You can see to that level of granular payment. And then those pay orders are reviewed and approved and signed by the board members. That's the process as it stands to how the board goes from voting on the budget to approving the payments on the items within the budget. Does that make sense? Kevin?
So the bullet toward the bottom says review, approved, and check signed by board representative and electorate appointed treasurer. Who's the board representative?
Well, the board representative would be the same person. That's the treasurer, right?
Okay.
That's your treasurer.
Okay.
We're sort of thinking that as the owner's rep, if you will.
So it's not and, it's.
No,
Right.
So,
should be, yeah, board
Is-
representative / electorate appointed treasurer.
okay,
Yeah,
so,
it's multiple description.
is it a statutory requirement that the board signs off on invoicing? What drives us to sign off? Everyone in this room to sign off on an invoice that's 30 to 60.
I know it's an audited requirement that that payments, the warrants for payments have been approved by the board members.
That's why I'm not sure if it's
But I don't know if it's
statute or if it's
fact,
audit requirement.
And we're
It's
signing
handled,
this stuff.
it's handled differently. It's handled differently in every district. And it's also handled differently at the Career Center. A lot of places, the Finance Committee reviews them and a couple of board members sign off on them on behalf of the entire board.
Still
That's
post facto, right?
Yep.
post facto. But at the Career Center, we have a sign-up sheet and it kind of rotates. People just come in every week and a couple of people come in
I
and
think
sign
that
off.
would speak to board procedure, if that's what the board chose to do, as long as the warrants are being signed off by the board or board representation.
Right.
And the
So
way,
the board,
you might have just said this, Steve, but right, that subcommittee that does the deeper review makes a recommendation to the board to pay the bills basically, and the board acts as a whole.
yeah, we don't, it's put on the consent agenda.
Right.
After it's signed off on by, a smaller group or a couple of people. And I believe that's the way a couple other districts in our area do that as well. I don't believe we're one of the few places where every single person signs the entire document.
It was on the Mat A board, everybody didn't sign it.
So I think it's something we could consider, and maybe even a recommendation that the Finance Committee might make, that we change the process. But it sounds to me like the way that it gets to us probably, or the fact that the layers and checks that happen before it gets to us would still be in place. And we're kind of after the fact, signing that. It's an example of where we typically don't really get involved in this level of detail. So it's funny when we're asked to by a requirement that is different from the way we normally practice our work. So it can cause some, questions from folks about why are we doing this and how does this connect? Kathy, did you have your hand up?
In order to change this process, because we are ex facto, it's after everything's said and done by the time we all sign off on it, it's redundant if we already have a representative checking everything for us. So in order for us to change this process, how do we do that?
So I think the only thing that it sounds like we could change, well, so we are approving the budget. That's our role, is in the conversation we just had.
Right, I got that. But how do we change having every single one of us having to sign off on?
So I'm going to suggest that is something that the Finance Committee can add to their agenda to talk about and propose a different way of doing it, because this is just,
because we should look at
we've done it procedurally, but it doesn't mean it can change. It can't change. It sounds like other districts have done it in different ways, so maybe they can look to that. I love that. Just love it. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to make a recommendation that we table the rest of you have links to all of our updates, and
Well, do we want to actually bring up ours? Is that possible or no? Okay. All right, sure. Never mind.
okay, sorry. I did notice though that there is a negotiations update on there. We need to have somebody else besides just one board member.
And, Lloyd, did you happen to find that number that Steve asked for?
4.7.
Huh?
4.7.
Thank you.
Who is the current?
It's
board
me.
member? Aaron. And who are the support staff?
Cheryl Kendall.
But for us, like, you're the support staff or the?
Yeah.
We're only negotiating support staff,
Yeah.
staff contract right now. That's the only one.
Gotcha.
Next year will be potentially both. It depends on how long the contract is for support staff.
How long is the negotiations have started already or not?
No.
We're waiting. And when are they expected to
Early November.
Yeah, November.
go until when?
The end. It's hard to know.
It's an action-oriented group. How about that?
Well, last time it was a little bit longer because we were doing a lot of restructuring of how this all went. This time it's really just the salary increase and making sure it follows that pattern. That's how we set it up. Gotcha. I could be wrong.
And we have great help usually from Katrina.
I'm hopeful for this next round.
It'll be smoother like it was.
I have sat in that role at a couple of meetings by myself, and it's really, 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 really unfair to our organization and hard as a board member to try to represent ourselves effectively.
Yeah, I was placed in this role back in March, but the Career Center, I'm now on their negotiation team for this fall for their full staff. So I'd rather not try to tackle both of those at the same time.
What's the kind of frequency of these meetings? I get it starts in November and it continues indefinitely.
It'll be done because we have to have it done in order, well, we don't have to have it done, but we kind of have to have it done for your budget.
Yeah.
But it's typically like every 2 weeks, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every couple weeks.
It'd be pretty rare that it's done before the budget, but it's usually done before contracts are issued.
Yeah, it'll probably finish up in May.
Well,
Yeah.
well, we were done well before that. We
Right,
were done
yeah.
well before. It's not a 6-month process, in other words. 3 months maybe.
And a couple of times a month.
Sometimes longer depending on what, like in between meetings, depending on what has though.
There's usually food.
Yeah, it's the time that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out if I can carve that out.
It's a mutually beneficial time, so.
They are typically mediated with a federal mediator. Someone that knows the organization pretty well and the players pretty well, assuming that all happens again as it has in the past, which every indication suggests that'll be true.
Pick your name out of a hat, yeah.
I think we might have to do that. Okie doke. Names out of a hat. You'll find out if you're the lucky winner. You want to do that right now, or do we want to?
Yeah. And if you're concerned that your term might end, there's a precedent that people are allowed to continue after their term just for negotiations. So we can leave that fear. So don't let that deter you.
We had to use that last time. Andrew did it. 2 people did it.
Andrew,
actually.
Kristen Blanchett has done it. You mentioned
Steve
Steve Barlow, so see?
Oh, esteemed vice chair and single representative, would you like to call, draw names now, get back to people? What do you want to do?
There's really no one interested.
I would do it, but I can't do November at all, so.
I don't know if that's helpful or not.
If it starts, I guess it's a question if it is for sure going to start in November. The first few meetings are important sort of process setting, and especially if you've done the process several times, it would be less of a big deal. But yeah,
I would imagine that.
I'm worried that it wouldn't be as effective as someone else. But
I was a first timer last year.
Yeah, I mean, I could do it maybe by Zoom, but
it might be worth exploring if that's the only thing getting in your way. We could probably have a conversation and see if starting in December was agreeable.
yeah, I'd be happy to do it then.
Especially if there's
Starting in
optimism
December.
that this year is a little bit more confined to maybe a few working conditions and salaries without some of the other more complicated things. Not that those can be pretty good.
We can ask, I guess. But if they say we're really interested in starting in November, that process, then is there anybody else? the people,
I can check back home.
Yeah.
With whether we can reasonably pull away those extra hours.
Mhm.
So somewhat stretched, to be honest.
Mhm.
But I'm happy to check and see what we could manage.
Mhm.
Which is not a lot, I understand.
No,
some
it's
go to
more
Olive
than
Branch.
nothing.
Yeah.
Is there anybody right now who knows 110% that they couldn't be part of it? Just really.
I don't think that's a reason to have that.
Okay. Justin, you're saying yes, you definitely cannot.
Well, I'm kind of in Mike's situation, just more time.
If you want to talk about time, put my hand up for that one.
You have lots of it?
No.
Hours to spare is what I'm hearing from Kevin.
But I'm gonna go with we cannot, we're not available.
Okay. Finance, you guys are okay?
Yeah, I mean, we're okay.
Okay.
I may reach out to you at some point.
Brad did too, about like, yes, so that's cool, fine. Okay, and Isabella said they were still really no big updates on community council. So, all right, so we are, we need an executive session under evaluation of an employee. We were going to invite Patrick for the beginning of that and then the rest of the time just the board. And I think we will adjourn after. So we can keep this Zoom link and we'll stop recording. And so we need do we want to do the meeting evaluation and then get a motion to go to executive session?
You want to do public comment first?
Sure.
Yep.
Is there any public comment? Nope. Okay. Thank you, Steve. Meeting evaluation? And it's got it out. Okay.
Level of engagement, high or low? Was agenda followed? Yes.
Almost. You
Yeah.
just make a couple switches.
Yeah. With amendments. Does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Any
Thank you
comment?
Thank you for dinner.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Thank you, to service folks.
Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of board process? Yes or no?
Yes. Yes.
Any comments? Other feedback for chair? What went well with the meeting?
Covered a lot of ground.
The small group discussion was nice.
Small group. Oh.
At first, yeah.
What suggestions do you have for ways to improve future meetings?
No,
All right.
Okay. So I need a motion to, thank you. And I need a motion to go into executive session, Title 1 VSA 5313A3, evaluation of an employee.
So move, Aaron.
Second, Sarah.
Okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, we're gonna stay put. We need to take a very.
I'm gonna say goodbye to.
And goodbye
That's there,
to
that's.
recording and thank you guys.